necessity of the hidden self. Welcome to the Quiet Hour, the only time where true power is forged. You think you're settling down, preparing for rest, but you are actually about to awaken the most dangerous, necessary part of yourself, the hidden operator. We are not here to meditate. We are here to master the subtle science of human patterns. This is 33 Psychological Laws of Power and the Art of Manipulation, designed for the moments just before sleep claims you. While your body unwinds, your deepest awareness will absorb the exact laws that govern influence, desire, and control. This isn't entertainment. This is calibration. You will learn to recognize the levers others pull, and more importantly, the ones you must grip to protect your peace. Every day, you navigate a battlefield of unspoken intentions. To succeed, you must adopt the necessary armor of cynicism and profound insight. But here is the critical paradox you must face tonight. Can you truly achieve inner peace and genuine safety while actively studying the mechanics of conflict and control? Can you utilize the laws of manipulation without becoming the very thing you seek to contain? The answer lies in the necessity of the hidden self. Keep listening, because ignorance is the only vulnerability you cannot afford tonight. The parallax of intent, why motives always blur. You spend so much energy trying to decipher the why. Why did they lie? Why did you compromise your own standard? Why did a gesture that felt profoundly kind suddenly seem conditional in retrospect? That relentless pursuit of a single, clean motive is perhaps the most exhausting and useless mental habit we maintain. It is the error of the novice observer, seeking crystalline purity in the chaotic mud of human consciousness. To transcend this, you must internalize the psychological law known as the parallax of intent. Parallax, in physics, is the apparent shift in an object's position when viewed from two different points. Psychologically, it means the perceived motive for any action, yours or theirs, changes fundamentally based on the observer's emotional distance and self-interest. There is no absolute north for motive, only relative positions. The intentionality fallacy is the belief that any complex human action is driven by one discernible, stable cause. It is never true. We are driven by a coalition of hidden agendas, unconscious programming, survival instincts, and often competing rationalizations, all layered so thickly they become indistinguishable even to the actor. Consider the simplest act of apparent altruism. You give someone a substantial gift, time, money, or resources, with no explicit conditions attached. The person receiving it is likely to believe the motive is pure generosity. You tell yourself, at the moment, that the motive is altruism. But watch the parallax in action. If a year later you need a favor from them and they decline or forget your sacrifice, your perception of your own original act instantly shifts. Was it true kindness or a preemptive investment, a strategic deposit into a social capital bank? The motive itself did not change at the moment of the gift. Your viewpoint of the outcome did, blurring the initial intent entirely. The mechanism of blurring is twofold: external complexity and internal rationalization. Externally, human actions are never driven by one pure force, but a complex, often contradictory coalition of interests: survival, approval, fear, desire, and status maintenance. Internally, our conscious mind is a skilled, tireless editor. We filter out the ugly, necessary motives, the crude, self-serving ones that threaten our self-image, and present the conscious mind with the purified, acceptable story. We call this primary mechanism the noble lie. You aren't merely protecting your own interests. You are ensuring the stability of the system. You aren't deeply jealous of their success. You are merely concerned for their poor judgment and the risks they are taking. We do not act, then find the motive. We act, and then we fabricate the motive that allows us to sleep at night, a narrative we can present to the world without shame. Think about navigating intense professional or romantic relationships. When a partner supports your difficult career change, or a colleague aggressively supports your promotion, stop hunting for the singular good motive. Is it genuine respect and deep love? Yes, perhaps 10%. Is it strategic positioning so that when you rise, they gain leverage, access, or emotional security? Yes, perhaps 40%. Is it simply adherence to an implicit social contract that makes their own world more comfortable? The remaining 50%. The error is demanding clarity where complexity is the only truth. The clarity you seek, the pure, static motive, is ultimately a tool for self-sabotage and vulnerability. Once you believe someone's motive is static and good, you disarm yourself to their strategic shifts, leaving you blindsided when the parallax shifts their position in your field of view. The psychological impact of embracing the parallax is profound freedom. When you stop obsessing over the definitive why, you can focus entirely on the definitive what. You shift your power from trying to map an unknowable internal landscape to responding objectively to observable behavior and measurable output. You stop trying to read the soul and start analyzing the trajectory. This is the true foundation of psychological resilience. You are no longer shocked when the hidden motive surfaces, because you understood it was always lurking in the periphery, waiting for the viewing angle to change. You accept that every action, no matter how selfless it appears, holds a shadow investment. The intent is a philosophical ghost. The action is the concrete reality. Stop chasing shadows. Judge the trajectory, not the supposed launch code. The scaffolding of charisma. Engineered resonance. We now descend into the mechanics of attraction, moving past mere presentation and into the deliberate architecture of influence. This is the understanding that charisma is not an unearned gift of magnetism, but a finely tuned instrument of strategic control. We will explore the principle of strategic absence, the power of the calculated silence. Have you ever noticed that the most captivating people are not the ones who talk the most, or even the ones who are the most immediately accommodating, but the ones who seem to know exactly when to stop, when to step back, leaving a slight persistent vacuum in the room? This principle is the cornerstone of engineered resonance. Strategic absence is the deliberate withdrawal of presence, information, or immediate enthusiasm, executed precisely to elevate your perceived value and trigger a powerful, often subconscious, psychological mechanism of completion in others. It is not about being mysterious for mystery's sake. It is about controlling the informational void. This strategy leverages scarcity, turning your availability, or lack thereof, into currency. Consider the metaphor of the master art collector and the empty pedestal. Imagine entering a gallery where one spectacular, solitary sculpture sits beautifully illuminated, but beside it, 3 smaller pedestals stand empty, carefully labeled with the names of masterpieces that are currently unobtainable or on loan. The visible sculpture, already impressive, now vibrates with elevated status. Its value is not judged solely on its own merit, but against the weight of the implied quality of the missing pieces. The collector understands that by highlighting what is absent, anticipation is engineered, and the available asset becomes infinitely more desirable. You, too, must curate your presence in this way. The deconstruction of this mechanism reveals a fundamental paradox of human interaction. True charisma is often born from withholding, not from giving. Your brain, the human brain, fundamentally hates ambiguity. It demands closure. When you leave a conversational or social gap, a pause, an unanswered question, an unrevealed detail of your history or intent, the other person's psychology rushes in to fill that vacuum. And crucially, what do they fill it with? They rarely fill it with negative assumptions. They fill it with projection, usually projecting their idealized version of the missing qualities onto you. They supply the narrative, the depth, the complexity that you strategically omitted. This tension, this internal cognitive labor performed by the other person on your behalf, is the very scaffolding upon which your engineered charisma is built. You become the repository of their highest expectations simply because you haven't given them enough data to contradict those expectations. This mechanism is applied daily in the modern world of connection. Watch the dynamic of communication. The person who replies to every text within seconds, who volunteers every detail of their weekend, who commits instantly to every casual invitation, signals low scarcity. They are entirely available, an open book, and therefore their gravitational pull is diminished. Contrast this with the person who introduces a calibrated delay, who responds not out of urgency, but out of measured attention, who allows the conversation to hang suspended for a moment, forcing the other party to reread, to anticipate, to wonder. This delay signals importance, signaling that your focus is a resource, not a reflex. You are communicating that your input is valuable because it is finite. The psychological impact of mastering strategic absence is profound. You shift from being merely receptive to being the conductor of attention. The realization dawns that your gravitational pull is proportional to your perceived independence. You are not maneuvering to be liked. You are defining the terms by which others need your input. This is the difference between being a temporary pleasure and becoming a necessary element in their psychological landscape. By mastering the art of the intentional gap, you force others to engage in the uncomfortable yet captivating work of decoding you, of earning your availability. They become invested in the pursuit of your completeness, and that investment binds them to you far more powerfully than any overt effort on your part ever could. True power is not about being universally seen. It is about defining the exact moment and the necessary criteria under which you allow yourself to be seen. You are the architect of your own scarcity, and in that scarcity lies your enduring resonance. Many stop here. They've had enough truth. But you didn't. Leave a like so I'll know you crossed that line. The entropy of gratitude. Why favors decay? Have you ever noticed how the purest, most desperate thanks seems to curdle into cold avoidance over time? You helped someone in their moment of need. They swore eternal loyalty. Yet 6 months later, they crossed the street to avoid your gaze. We often misunderstand the true psychological cost of receiving help, assuming that gratitude is a sustainable resource. It is not. This is the entropy of gratitude, the inevitable decay of social debt. This psychological law is not about common ingratitude. It is about social debt thermodynamics. When you extend a significant favor, a massive loan, an unearned opportunity, a life-altering rescue, you establish an energy imbalance. In that moment, you become the powerful creditor, and the recipient becomes the dependent debtor. Gratitude is the initial release valve. It's the emotional interest paid immediately upon receipt of the favor. But that initial feeling, that pure, overwhelming sense of relief and appreciation, does not settle the account. It only registers the debt. You now owe time, effort, or reciprocity, and if that debt is not actively repaid, it doesn't vanish. It transmutes. It becomes psychological pressure, and that pressure frequently manifests as resentment toward the creditor. Consider the untended loan. Imagine a heavy, elaborate gift that truly changes the trajectory of a person's life, the crucial investment that saves their home or funds their first major success. In the moment of transfer, tears flow. Promises are made, but follow that timeline 6 months out, or a year. That gift ceases being a simple boon and transforms into a perpetual reminder of deficiency. Every time the debtor looks at the successful structure they now inhabit, they see the foundational stone that someone else placed for them. They are successful because of you. This is the psychological paradox. The favor, designed to elevate, ends up threatening the recipient's deepest sense of self-reliance and autonomy. When someone does you a massive, non-trivial favor, they temporarily gain a psychological position of superiority. You, the recipient, are placed in a posture of humiliating dependence. The human psyche fiercely resists this asymmetry, viewing dependency as a critical vulnerability. To restore internal equilibrium and protect its fragile sense of self-mastery, the mind executes a defensive and often brutal maneuver. It must devalue the creditor or minimize the debt. The favor decay is not a failure to remember. It is the urgent psychological need to forget the power imbalance. If the recipient can convince themselves, subconsciously of course, that you were somehow obligated or that the favor wasn't that difficult, or even that you are fundamentally a bad person despite your help, then the psychological debt is neutralized. If I resent you, I no longer owe you respect or deference. The resentment becomes an unconscious power play designed to equalize the social standing, allowing the recipient to finally claim their success as fully their own. This mechanism reveals why unsolicited advice or over-the-top sacrificial generosity strains relationships far more than light conflict. The friend or family member who constantly saves you, who intervenes dramatically in crises, even with the purest intentions, is creating an unwinnable debt cycle. You start avoiding their calls not because they are malicious, but because their very presence triggers the shame of the unpaid social ledger. The most insidious form of manipulation, therefore, is not coercion, but making someone perpetually and overwhelmingly grateful. They become bound by their debt. This law dictates how the powerful must operate. If your goal is control, maintain the debt. Keep reminding them subtly what you did. But if you seek genuine connection and loyalty, you must learn the art of the non-debt favor, the favor given with zero emotional or reciprocal expectation, the help that is immediately dismissed or downplayed after the fact. The powerful know that a truly successful favor is one that the recipient feels they are capable of repaying immediately, or better yet, one they are allowed to forget entirely, because favors are not investments in loyalty. They are liabilities held by the recipient. And like all unsecured debts, they eventually default, leaving behind only the cold ashes of obligation. Mapping the blind spots of the vigilant, there is a strange, quiet arrogance that settles upon the mind once it begins to understand the mechanics of manipulation and power dynamics. You, the astute observer, the one who prides yourself on seeing the strings, begin to assume a sort of immunity, a philosophical armor against the crude attempts of others. This assumption, this sophistication, is precisely the target in the deepest levels of psychological warfare. We must now map the very blind spots created by hypervigilance itself. We call this the scapegoat of intelligence, the lure of complexity. You pride yourself on seeing the strings, on tracking the trajectory of the subtle lie and the hidden agenda. But what if the successful manipulator knows exactly where your eyes are calibrated to look? What if the sophistication you have cultivated becomes the very tunnel vision they rely upon? This concept describes a profound paradox. Highly intelligent, self-aware, and overly cautious individuals often fall for simple, low-effort manipulations precisely because they are relentlessly filtering for high-level, Byzantine complexity, thereby overlooking the obvious, human truth hidden in plain sight. This is the psychological law of selective attention, weaponized against the vigilant mind. Your defense is so optimized for the subtle threat that it becomes allergic to the blunt one. Imagine the master safecracker, the kind who understands every nuance of tumbler mechanics, who can hear the infinitesimal click of a spring under pressure. He spends hours developing sophisticated anti-detection techniques, bypassing complex electronic surveillance, ready for the high-tech, stunning obstacle. And yet, he is foiled by a single, cheap tripwire, a thin, almost invisible strand of nylon stretched tautly across the floor, disguised by a layer of innocuous dust. He never saw it because it was too simple. His mind was trained to seek the elaborate lock, not the elementary obstacle. The mechanism at play here is the ego of vigilance. You do not fear being manipulated. You fear being manipulated easily. To be tricked by an overly complicated, ingenious scheme allows your ego a soft landing. It was too brilliant, too subtle. But to be tricked by a common hustle, a predictable lie, implies a deep, shameful naivety you believed you had shed years ago. A truly powerful manipulator understands this psychological need for complexity. They exhaust your cognitive resources by presenting a complex, distracting decoy, a beautiful, convoluted story, or a dramatic political conflict, knowing that your vigilant mind will devote its entire processing power to analyzing the decoy's architecture. While you are intellectually wrestling with the shadow puppet show, the manipulator delivers the fundamental, basic human appeal, or the straightforward lie, hidden beneath the distracting noise. The paradox is devastating. You look so far ahead, predicting the next 5 moves on the chessboard, that you entirely miss the pawn move that walls in your king right now. This dynamic is rampant in modern informational warfare, social engineering, and, painfully, in intimate relationship dynamics. We spend countless hours overanalyzing the cryptic subtext of a text message, searching for the subtle gaslight, the hidden motive, the complex layer of plausible deniability. In doing so, we fail to recognize the clear, straightforward lie that was intentionally designed to seem too simple, too blunt, or too obvious to be effective. We dismiss the simple truth because we believe we are too clever to be fooled by it. The truly powerful psychological move is often the simplest one you discounted as beneath your notice. The highest form of manipulation is making the victim believe they are too intelligent to be victimized. The psychological cost of this blind spot is twofold. It leads to cognitive exhaustion, constantly searching for ghosts in the machine, and it results in utterly predictable defense patterns. When the manipulator knows you are always looking for complexity, X, they simply distract you with dramatic noise, Y, while delivering the simple truth, Z. True psychological security is not achieved through ceaseless vigilance, but through simplicity, radical acceptance of basic human flaws, and a profound detachment from the desperate need to always be the smartest person in the room. Your defense should be like water, adapting to the container, not like concrete, rigid and easily circumvented. The easiest path to blind a brilliant mind is to offer a shadow too small to be worth chasing. The subtlety of controlled withdrawal. You must accept that gravity dictates movement and scarcity dictates value. Law 19 dictates the scarce resource. Theory of desire. Why is it that the moment someone stops needing you, truly stops pursuing your attention, you suddenly find yourself needing them more than ever? It is a cold, mechanical truth. The true measure of power is not how much you possess, but how strategically and skillfully you can revoke access to what you possess. This is the mechanism of controlled withdrawal. It is the tactical decision to reduce your availability, not out of avoidance, but to artificially inflate your perceived value. This principle is not new. It is derived directly from economic laws. Scarcity drives demand, applied relentlessly to emotional and social capital. It is essential to understand that controlled withdrawal is not the same as passive aggression or running away. It is the purposeful pruning of the vine to ensure that the few grapes remaining are coveted, rare, and therefore priceless. Imagine a highly guarded gallery. The curators possess a priceless artifact, but they know that if it were left out in the open, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, its mystical uniqueness would inevitably plummet. So they keep it under heavy velvet ropes, shown only during brief, scheduled intervals, announced with pomp and circumstance. Your attention, your time, your emotional availability, these are your priceless artifacts. Your strategic withdrawal, your moment of silence, your manufactured delay in response. This is the velvet rope. When you are constantly present, you are static background noise. The moment you introduce absence, you introduce tension, and tension is the most fertile ground for desire. The core conflict resides in the human brain's desire for certainty versus its powerful, addictive attraction to the chase. When you are fully available, the relationship, the negotiation, or the friendship is mentally filed under known quantity. There is no effort required for retention. But when you withdraw, you create a vacuum, and the mind, which abhors a vacuum, rushes to fill that empty space with speculation, memory, and, crucially, projected value. They are not necessarily missing you. They are missing the easy, certain future they had invented while you were reliably present. By stepping back, you are effectively transferring the emotional labor, the effort required for the relationship's preservation, from your shoulders to theirs. They must now work to close the gap you created. Consider the reality of modern digital life. We have destroyed the space needed for anticipation. Instantaneity through text messages, DMs, and immediate replies has convinced us that we should be constantly accessible, turning attention into a commodity with zero transactional cost. Controlled withdrawal means reclaiming that necessary delay. It means pausing before you respond to a desperate text or a crisis call, not because you are truly too busy, but because the immediate, predictable balm of your presence fundamentally cheapens the gravity of your presence when it finally arrives. If you are always the quick fix, you are never the essential cure. This practice is the psychological method of establishing gravitational force. When you are consistently present and always orbiting their needs, you are merely a predictable feature of their emotional landscape. But when you withdraw, the entire landscape shifts to accommodate your absence. This creates a gravitational pull that forces others to circle back, to seek you out, to initiate the pursuit. It is a profound, silent lesson delivered without a single demanding word. It teaches them that your involvement is a hard-won privilege, not an automatic guarantee. It forces them to confront and respect your boundaries, because the realized consequence of disrespect or taking you for granted is the terrifying prospect of losing access completely. You become the necessary center of their orbit precisely because you proved you can and will move away. Never mistake availability for accessibility. The true masters of influence understand that the most potent and enduring form of control is not the threat of attack, nor the promise of reward, but the silent, unnerving, and permanent prospect of your controlled silence. The architecture of cognitive dissonance. The architecture of cognitive dissonance. The self-deception economy. How much mental energy do you spend every day justifying choices you know deep down betray your truest self? Relax. We're not here to judge those choices, only to look at the blueprints of the internal mechanism you use to rationalize them. This is the bedrock of psychological manipulation, because the most efficient self-deception is the one you build yourself. In 1957, Leon Festinger introduced this concept, cognitive dissonance, as the profound psychological discomfort experienced when an individual simultaneously holds two or more conflicting cognitions, beliefs, values, or specific actions. It is not merely disagreement. It is stress, a deep, pervasive need for internal coherence. Your mind abhors chaos. When a contradiction appears, when you act against a firmly held belief, your internal world demands resolution, and it will often take the path of least resistance, which is rarely the path of truth. To illustrate, consider the world-class cardiologist, the man who lectures on preventative heart disease, yet steps outside the conference hall every hour to smoke a cigarette. He knows the data better than anyone else alive. His professional knowledge, smoking kills, is directly dissonant with his personal action, smoking. The discomfort is immense. How does he resolve this? He has three choices. The first is to stop smoking, change the action. This is often too hard, requiring immense willpower. The second is to genuinely believe that smoking is healthy, change the belief. This is often impossible, as the external evidence is overwhelming. Therefore, he chooses the third and most insidious option. He creates a new, justifying cognition. He tells himself, I am under so much stress, the cessation anxiety would actually kill me faster. Or, my superior genetics make me immune to the statistical risks. He did not change the action, nor did he truly change the core belief. He merely built a sophisticated mental annex, an architectural wonder of self-deception, designed solely to house the lie and neutralize the discomfort. The deconstruction of this mechanism reveals a profound vulnerability exploited in power dynamics. Manipulation is the art of initiating dissonance in another person, then stepping back and allowing their own psyche to do the hard work of justification. We typically think of resolution as finding the truth, but resolution is simply reaching emotional homeostasis. To resolve the discomfort, we don't necessarily seek the most honest answer. We seek the quickest path back to feeling good about ourselves. This path is almost always the introduction of a justifying cognition. This is why small initial conflicts necessitate large internal lies. If you are coerced into performing a boring, tedious task for a small reward, your internal dissonance is severe. I spent my valuable time doing this, but the reward was tiny. Your mind resolves this by convincing you the task wasn't boring at all. In fact, I enjoyed it. It was deeply meaningful. You increase the perceived value of the task to match the value of the time spent. Had you received a large reward, the dissonance would be minor. The reward justifies the time. The smaller the external pressure, the greater the internal justification must be, binding you tightly to the resulting delusion. This is the mechanism by which cults and abusive relationships thrive. Force a small, embarrassing, contradictory action, and the victim's mind will construct an entire narrative framework to justify their continued compliance. In the emotional landscape of modern life, we see this everywhere, particularly in political tribalism and the defense of sunk costs. We spend years investing identity into a relationship, a career, or a specific worldview. Admitting that the investment was flawed or that the path was wrong would trigger catastrophic dissonance. The psychological cost of tearing down the architecture of the past is often perceived as greater than the continuous, miserable effort of maintaining the lie. We become architects of our own prisons, adding mental reinforcement whenever a nagging doubt tries to break through the facade. What changes inside of us when we understand this process is the recognition that freedom is synonymous with the tolerance of contradiction. The manipulator only needs to plant the seed of conflict. If you can withstand the initial agonizing discomfort of holding two contradictory truths simultaneously, I am a good person, and I made a terrible mistake, without immediately rushing to construct a lie to smooth it over, you reclaim your autonomy. The architecture of self-deception is powerful, but it relies entirely on your fear of internal noise. The only thing cognitive dissonance truly fears is the quiet, uncompromising acceptance of inconsistency. The architecture stands strong only until the moment you decide the cost of maintaining the lie is greater than the necessary demolition of the truth.
The price of authenticity, a calculated liability. You are constantly told to be authentic. But have you ever considered that the truth of who you are might be the most valuable and thus the most dangerous currency you possess? We arrive now at the vulnerability index of truth. Authenticity, in the cold calculus of power dynamics, is rarely a virtue. It is fundamentally information density. It is the precise topographical map of your desires, your fears, your unmitigated reactions, and the specific algorithms that govern your compliance. This map, once handed over freely, transforms instantaneously from a badge of honor into a blueprint for your predictable control. We are not discussing moral integrity here. We are discussing operational liability. The more raw you present to the external world, the fewer degrees of psychological freedom you retain in any negotiation, personal or professional. Your transparency is highly efficient data gathering for anyone seeking leverage. Imagine a highly fortified vault that holds immense treasure. The most protected and classified document pertaining to that vault is not the ledger of its contents, but the architectural schematics, the structural weaknesses, the access codes, the ventilation routes, and the precise sequence of the fail-safes. Your raw, unedited self is that schematic. When you embrace radical transparency, you are essentially publishing the floor plan of your soul to a world that often operates based on predatory efficiency. They don't need to guess your pressure points. You've labeled them clearly and signed the document. The mechanism by which authenticity becomes a liability is simple and hinges entirely on the principle of the predictable target. Power abhors randomness. If I, your observer, know your core values, your non-negotiable standards, your deep-seated loyalties, the specific insults that wound you most deeply, and the nature of the validation you desperately seek, I can precisely calculate the exact stimulus required to elicit your desired response. Authenticity guarantees consistency. Consistency guarantees predictability. And predictability, when leveraged by a powerful actor, guarantees control. This is the profound paradox. The very human desire to pursue genuine connection and to be fully seen makes you maximally exploitable. You crave to be truly known, but the moment you are truly known, you surrender a substantial portion of your mystery, and the known defined entity is always weaker than the mysterious undefined variable. Calculated omission is not lying, it is strategic self-preservation. It is the intelligent filtering of non-essential data points that others might weaponize. Now connect this idea to the present moment. Look at the modern digital and social landscape. We are taught to reward radical vulnerability with engagement, with clicks, and with ephemeral validation that lasts as long as a serotonin spike. But every confession, every shared weakness, every detailed preference, every deep emotional reaction you display is not fostering empathy. It is feeding data points into an algorithm, not for human connection, but for optimization. Optimization of targeted advertising, optimization of political persuasion, optimization of emotional leverage against you. Your perceived self-expression becomes merely the data set that makes you the perfect compliant consumer or the easily manipulated ideological soldier. The system loves your authenticity precisely because it makes you cheap to market to and effortless to control. A genuine, predictable flaw is easier to exploit than a strategic silence. This realization necessitates a deep shift in your operational baseline. You must move from viewing social interaction as a mechanism primarily for self-expression to viewing it as a strategic deployment of information. This does not require you to become pathologically deceitful, but it requires you to become deeply, consciously filtered. The critical shift is internal. You must recognize that the boundary between your inner sovereign world and the external competitive matrix must be governed by conscious utility, not reflexive emotional impulse. You learn to negotiate the gap between who you truly are and who you allow others to perceive, a gap that is not an act of hypocrisy, but an essential defense mechanism for maintaining psychological sovereignty. True power resides not in hastily revealing the full truth, but in mastering the selective, masterful presentation of it. Let them see the reflection they expect to see, while the real source of the light remains perfectly obscured, perfectly safe. The ritual sacrifice of the mirror self. The law of necessary self-abolition is perhaps the darkest truth you must confront on your journey toward psychological sovereignty. You've spent your entire life polishing a reflection that wasn't you, haven't you? Tonight, as the world sleeps, we admit that the deepest chains are the ones we willingly fasten to our own image, forging an identity designed solely for the comfort and consumption of others. The mirror self is the curated persona, the highly socialized shadow designed exclusively to maximize acceptance and minimize conflict. It is the ego that constantly asks, "What do they want me to be right now?" This persistent query, this ceaseless tuning of your internal dial to match external expectations is the very definition of psychological weakness. True power demands radical singularity, and singularity requires the intentional, ritualistic destruction of that agreeable, compliant facade. We must sacrifice the reflection to save the original. Imagine holding a perfect, seamless glass mask up to your face. It mimics your smile flawlessly, it catches the ambient light beautifully, and everyone you interact with seems to instantly relax in the presence of the wearer of the mask. But this glass prevents you from breathing deeply. Every perception and every genuine reaction is filtered through its cold, artificial surface. You have become dependent on the mask's performance. The ritual sacrifice we speak of is not about destroying you, the complex, messy entity beneath. It is about shattering the glass mask so violently that you can finally feel the raw, unfiltered air of reality on your true face. This act is essential because your greatest vulnerability is not what you lack, but the predictability inherent in your need to be liked. The paradox of the mirror self is this: we are taught that safety lies in conformity, but conformity makes us utterly predictable, and predictability, in the silent arena of human power dynamics, is the greatest possible vulnerability. The moment you are predictable, you are maneuverable. The mechanism of the necessary sacrifice is recognizing the exact moments when you perform for an audience that is either irrelevant or non-existent. It involves identifying the scripts you run daily to please the memory of an old teacher, the expectations of your immediate social circle, or the judgmental ghost of your past self. Every time you mute a strong opinion, every time you laugh at a joke you don't find funny, every time you choose silence over the friction of truth, you are feeding the mirror self. When you consciously cease this performance, when you simply stop giving energy to the reflection, the mirror self begins to starve. This cessation of performance, this withdrawal of manufactured consent, creates profound tension within your relationships, a fear of being seen as difficult, radical, or simply too much. Understand that this tension is not a failure. It is the signpost of your liberation. It is the friction required to break the frame. Consider how the modern emotional landscape reinforces this weakness. How often do you mute a challenging opinion during a high-stakes meeting simply to avoid the social tax of disagreement? How often do you purchase an identity, a specific brand, a luxury item, a curated lifestyle, not because you genuinely desire the object, but because you desire the sophisticated, socially approved story that object tells about the person you want others to believe you are? Modern life is meticulously designed to commodify the mirror self. Every social platform, every algorithm, feeds it and weaponizes it against you. To perform this ritual sacrifice is to reclaim your most valuable capital, your time, your money, your emotional energy, from the volatile market of identity approval. You divest from the image economy. The immediate psychological impact of this sacrifice is both staggering and initially terrifying. It manifests as acute loneliness, followed by a profound, unshakable self-possession. You realize the true cost of social acceptance was not high but absolute. It was the complete surrender of your personal sovereignty. This act of self-abolition is the foundational prerequisite for true self-alignment. Once the compliant mirror image is purposefully shattered, attempts at manipulation simply fail because the manipulation artists have no target left to address. There is no agreeable, consensus-driven persona waiting to follow their script. You cease to be a puppet responding to external strings and instantly become the single, unified source of your own movement and intention. The philosophical implication is unavoidable. Authenticity is not a gentle discovery found during quiet introspection. It is a violent, necessary removal of the inauthentic. You must choose to break yourself apart to finally be whole. Shatter the reflection. Only the sharp, dangerous shards reveal the full depth of what you actually are. The Law of Contextual Morality. You believe you possess a moral core, an immovable structure defining right and wrong, a personal constitution that dictates your boundaries. This is comforting, a soft blanket woven from upbringing and societal norms, but it is also a profound vulnerability. The Law of Contextual Morality states that your ethics are not a fixed destination, but a fluid landscape, entirely dependent on the immediate scarcity, pressure, and threat perceived by the self. Your moral operating system, the one that tells you who you are, is nothing more than an algorithm running on environmental inputs, ready to rewrite its own code when the context shifts from comfort to consequence. The fundamental question is not if you would break your rules, but what precise set of external conditions would compel you to do so without hesitation. Have you ever done something you swore you never would, simply because the stakes were no longer theoretical but immediate and absolute? This is the moment when psychology triumphs over philosophy, where survival, or success, which is modern survival, becomes the highest moral imperative. Consider the classic ethical crucible, the lifeboat dilemma. You are adrift, miles from shore, sharing a single, barely buoyant plank with one other person. The contextual input is immediate and critical. The plank can only support one. The morality you held yesterday, the one that defined you as kind, helpful, non-violent, is now irrelevant. The only active, relevant context is survival. If you choose to save yourself, The act of pushing the other person into the freezing darkness is not registered by your primal brain as a crime, but as a necessary maintenance function. Your consciousness, desperate to maintain integrity, begins to deploy cognitive sanitization. You tell yourself they were weak, or that they had already accepted their fate, or that their survival was simply less important than the future you still have to fulfill. The moral transgression becomes a narrative necessity, a clean surgical cut performed to save the larger body of the self. This is the central lesson of power. The strongest players do not possess superior morality. They possess superior contextual awareness. They recognize the moment the environment demands a moral shift, and they execute the change without the paralyzing friction of guilt. They understand that morality is judged externally, but its consequences are felt internally. The paradox is that the moment you choose the action the context demands, the manipulation, the strategic betrayal, the ruthless acquisition, you must construct a flawless internal narrative that declares the act good, or at least necessary for a greater good. If you fail to sanitize the action, the resulting psychological dissonance will consume you, rendering you weak and hesitant for the next critical moment. You cannot wield power effectively while simultaneously punishing yourself for the means required to acquire it. In the contemporary world, the stakes often appear lower, but the mechanism remains identical. You see it in the cutthroat atmosphere of the corporate ladder, where teamwork gives way to strategic elimination when a promotion is on the line. You see it at the negotiation table, where transparency transforms into carefully curated deception when a massive advantage is at stake. The moment you define your morality not by rigid commandments, but by the operational needs of the current situation, you unlock a terrifying flexibility. You realize that protecting your family, defending your career, or securing your peace are contexts that ethically justify actions you would previously have condemned in others. Necessity is the greatest moral disinfectant. The terrifying insight you must absorb is this: you are capable of anything. You are only a good person until the context demands that you cease to be, and the moment that demand arrives, you will find the justification within seconds. This knowledge removes the comfort of moral inertia. You must now face the freedom and the terror of knowing that your morality is merely a setting on the control panel of your will, ready to be adjusted based on the optimal outcome. Power resides precisely where your old moral boundaries used to stand. You must decide if those old boundaries are worth the cost of the context you now inhabit. Morality is not a shield meant to defend your character. It is a highly specialized tool waiting patiently for the perfect, demanding hand to pick it up and use it strategically. The gaze of the other as prison. The radical transparency paradox. This is where we stop looking at manipulation as something that is solely external and start realizing that the most powerful controller in your life is often a construct of your own making, a warden we appointed years ago. Have you ever felt utterly exposed, not because someone was physically spying on you, but because you were constantly measuring your private self against an invisible public standard? That suffocating awareness that every choice, every silence, every consumption pattern is being mentally cataloged and judged by invisible observers, perhaps even by the ghost of a critic from your past. That feeling is not paranoia. It is the fundamental mechanism of external control, psychological self-censorship enforced by the anticipated judgment. Philosophically, this concept is derived from Jean-Paul Sartre's foundational existential idea of le regard, the gaze. It posits that when the other looks at you, your internal reality immediately shifts. You are instantly converted from a subject capable of free, limitless choice and pure potential into an object fixed, categorized, and trapped within the reality constructed by their perception. Your subjective freedom vanishes the moment you are conscious of being perceived, transforming the other person, even momentarily, into an all-powerful judge. This realization is profoundly disorienting because your entire self-concept becomes contingent, dependent on an external interpretation. To understand this deep psychological shift, consider the classic existential illustration. Imagine you are kneeling. looking intently through a keyhole, completely absorbed in your intent, unaware of yourself as an entity. In that moment, you are pure subjectivity, pure spontaneous freedom. Suddenly, you hear the distinct sound of footsteps behind you, followed by a slight pause. In that instant, your consciousness snaps outward, focusing intensely on the external presence. You are no longer the free agent looking. You are instantly transformed into the person being seen, looking through a keyhole, a voyeur, a trespasser, a defined thing that is embarrassed, potentially judged and fixed in that humiliating posture. That moment of sudden self-awareness, that conversion from being for itself to being for others, is the psychological prison cell being locked around your freedom. The mechanism of external control is tragically self-perpetuating because the true power of the gaze is not exerted by the person looking. It is exerted by you, on yourself in anticipation of them looking. We internalize the societal script, the expected role, the acceptable level of ambition, competence, or contentment. This internal censor, this ghost of the collective judgment, becomes the most efficient and dedicated guard of the prison. We preemptively restrict our own actions, filter our beliefs, and censor our speech, not necessarily for the sake of physical survival, but for the sake of maintaining a coherent, approved object status within the collective narrative. The perpetual anxiety we feel is the friction between our infinite inner freedom and the rigid outer form we force ourselves to inhabit to avoid the terror of being misinterpreted or judged as inadequate. In the modern landscape, the ubiquity of social media and networking technologies is the ultimate non-stop gaze. The smartphone camera is the perpetual keyhole. It forces you to exist solely as a meticulously curated object, a feed, a profile, a brand, because the gaze is always active, always hungry. You are constantly optimizing your existence for external validation metrics, chasing likes and comments that are merely superficial affirmations of your successfully manufactured objecthood. This isn't just simple vanity. It's a structural necessity of living under the perpetual, networked gaze. We are literally performing our lives for an audience, often sacrificing genuine, messy, subjective experience for documented, curated, and externally approved experience. The self we present is the mask we believe will earn the least amount of critical attention. The ultimate cost of this perpetual external orientation is the death of authenticity. When your very identity is sourced externally, drawn from the reflections in the eyes of others, you become profoundly malleable and easily manipulated. If I, as the external agent, know what version of yourself you believe the world demands, I know exactly which emotional levers to pull to elicit the desired performance, the required compliance, or the perfect public apology. Power in this context is the ability to define the other, to cast the primary judgment, and thus force them into a predefined, limiting role. The ultimate vulnerability is the desperate, exhausting need to escape the terrifying responsibility of absolute subjectivity and settle into the comfortable, yet stifling, cage of external definition. Recognize that the only path to true psychological sovereignty is to fundamentally stop seeking affirmation in the reflection of the other. You must cease granting the gaze its defining authority. You must reclaim your subjectivity, accepting the profound loneliness that often accompanies true freedom. Because the moment you choose to act based purely on your own internal calculus, indifferent to the expected external verdict, the psychological prison gates dissolve. The calculus of necessary ambiguity. Why is it that the moment you define your deepest desire, it seems to lose its power? Have you ever noticed that true gravitational pull exists only in the space, before the answer is given, in the pregnant pause, in the half smile, in the promise that is not quite a commitment? We move now to the calculus of strategic non-definition, a fundamental law that separates the master manipulator from the common reactor. This is the calculus of necessary ambiguity. Necessary ambiguity is the intentional cultivation of the non-defined space. It is the understanding that certainty provides your opponent with a stationary target, while ambiguity grants you profound mobility and infinite optionality. When you are definitively clear, you are bound by that definition. Your boundaries are known, your limits are tested, and your leverage evaporates. But when you are in necessary ambiguity, you transform into a projected landscape. It is not simply lying, it is the art of leaving the canvas intentionally blank, so that the audience, the target, is forced to project their own desires, their own fears, and their own greatest hopes onto your silence. They invest themselves in the meaning you refuse to provide. Consider the metaphor of the figure in the fog. You are pursuing someone or something you desperately need to understand, but the landscape is obscured by a dense psychological haze. Because you cannot see the details, your mind rushes to fill the void. The figure remains simultaneously everything and nothing, potentially dangerous, potentially benevolent, potentially the key to your future. The pursuit becomes addictive precisely because the identity of the target is undefined. It maintains maximum threat and maximum allure simultaneously. The moment the fog lifts and you realize the figure is merely a scarecrow, a trick of light, or an insignificant rival, the chase ends. The tension dies. The power was never in the reality. The power was in the distance, in the non-resolution. This leverages the most powerful engine in the human psyche, the drive to resolve patterns and eliminate cognitive dissonance. When you provide an ambiguous answer, or worse, when you act in a way that generates multiple possible interpretations of your intent, you force the recipient's internal mechanisms to work for you. Their energy is spent trying to define your position, to triangulate your next move, to understand your truth, rather than calculating their own effective defense. This is the paradox of influence. Clarity leads to the exhaustion of interest. Ambiguity leads to the investment of energy. By remaining the central puzzle, you maintain control of the conversation, the relationship, and the narrative flow. We see this played out daily in the economy of modern attention. Look at the perfectly curated social media profile, the detailed syllabus, the meticulously planned life. These are often predictable and disposable, but the person who uses pregnant pauses, who hints at deeper knowledge they refuse to share, who makes statements that can be interpreted 3 different ways, that person becomes the gravitational center. They are the maybe. And maybe holds more psychological endurance than yes or no, because maybe requires waiting, requires interpretation, and most importantly, it requires hope. It keeps the door open just enough to keep the other person calculating the cost of commitment versus the cost of loss. You never have to commit because they are already committed to the calculation itself. To master this necessary calculus requires a brutal internal surrender. You must surrender the need for immediate validation. You must become comfortable being misunderstood, and you must tolerate the friction that ambiguity creates. The ego craves affirmation, definition, and praise, but power craves non-definition, optionality, and silence. The most definitive thing you can say is often nothing at all, allowing your silence to become the loudest answer in the room, an answer that they must perpetually struggle to translate. Your greatest asset is the question mark you strategically refuse to remove from your own identity. The ultimate certainty is that nothing is certain, especially your next move. Learn to love the horizon line, because the power is not in the destination, but in the infinite promise of the road you cannot fully see. The currency of unsolicited advice. We must now examine one of the cheapest and most corrosive forms of attempted social dominance, the law governing unsolicited advice. You know the feeling, that distinct, almost physical pressure in your chest when you witness someone else struggling with a path you have already navigated, or perhaps even a path you only believe you have navigated successfully. Why do you feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to intervene, to speak the perfect, simplifying sentence, to fix their situation, even when they have not signaled any genuine need for your perspective? This urge, often disguised as radical empathy or compassionate wisdom, is seldom about helping the other person. It is rooted in a fundamental human drive to confirm your own perceived superiority, a deep desire to prove that you are one step ahead of the curve, that you have mastered a complexity the other person has yet to grasp. The currency of unsolicited advice is status, and it is almost always a deeply depreciated one. Unsolicited advice is simply a hierarchical signal wrapped in the packaging of altruism. It is a social transaction where the giver seeks validation, not genuine influence. By inserting yourself into someone else's decision matrix, you are implicitly stating, I possess superior information or insight, and therefore, I hold a temporary position of elevated authority over your predicament. It requires zero risk from the giver. You are not the one implementing the solution. You are not the one facing the consequences of the failure, yet you attempt to claim the intellectual credit for the potential success. Consider the metaphor of the advisor on the hill. You are standing on high ground, comfortable and secure, watching the travelers struggle in the muddy valley below, trying to decipher a map. From your vantage point, the correct route is perfectly obvious. You feel compelled to shout down directions, easy, simple, decisive. But you must ask yourself, are you yelling down the advice because it saves the traveler time, or because the act of yelling proves your own elevated position? You are safe from the risk of the mud, safe from the fatigue of the journey, yet you are the first to claim mastery over the landscape. If the traveler fails, it is because they poorly executed your perfect instruction. If they succeed, it is confirmation of your superior foresight. This is the ultimate low-risk, high-reward move for the ego. We encounter the paradox of inverse value. When you seek advice, you must humble yourself. You must admit vulnerability, confess a lapse in judgment or knowledge, and invest significant emotional capital just to ask the question. This high cost of seeking advice ensures that the answer, when received, is valued greatly. Conversely, advice given freely, without being solicited, carries zero cost for the giver. They did not need to be prompted. They simply chose to speak. It is offered cheaply, and thus, it is often dismissed cheaply. The psychological mechanism at play is a status transfer. The giver temporarily transfers their self-perceived competence onto the receiver, momentarily shifting the power dynamic. The receiver often feels resentment, not gratitude, because the exchange was non-consensual. Their dilemma was used as a stage for your performance of wisdom. Look around at the digital landscape, the modern manifestation of this psychological law. Every comment section, every family group chat, every endless scroll of opinions is filled with experts advising on situations they are completely removed from. We have constructed an economy built on cheap, disposable guidance, the 2 cents offered freely to mask the giver's own internal uncertainties. This frantic need to advise others is often just a sophisticated defense mechanism, a distraction from the complexities of your own unaddressed issues. It is easier to solve the theoretical, external problem than to face the deeply personal, messy, internal one. The psychological impact is clear. For the giver, it is a false sense of competency, a fleeting shot of dopamine fueled by the illusion of control. For the receiver, it is often a silent insult, a subtle form of passive aggression that undermines their agency and their ability to solve their own problems. True psychological power is not found in the rush to provide answers, but in the strategic withholding of knowledge. When you force someone to ask, when you remain silent and let the pressure build until they approach you seeking counsel, you establish a legitimate authority. They have granted you power willingly through their vulnerability. They have paid the cost of the question, ensuring they will value the answer. Silence, in this context, is not merely the absence of sound. It is the active, strategic management of attention. It forces the world to lean in. Learn to hold your peace, and watch how quickly the world changes its posture around you. Do not spend your gold like loose change. The wisdom you possess is not meant to be tossed into the wind. It is meant to be legitimately earned by those who require it. The greatest power is the right to remain quiet when everyone expects you to speak. The unspoken language of proxemics. Have you ever felt a sudden, inexplicable alarm bell ring in your gut? Not because of what someone said, but purely because of how close they stood. That profound, visceral jolt is the sound of your primal boundaries being tested, the invisible wall of your territory being pressed. This is the domain of proxemics, the silent, ancient language of space that defines status, commands attention, and can be subtly weaponized in any interaction. This is the invisible territory, the dynamic field between you and everyone else, and the person who controls that distance often controls the outcome. The concept was formally mapped out by anthropologist Edward T. Hall, classifying the 4 distinct spatial zones we unconsciously maintain. There is the public zone, beyond 12 feet, used for formal speaking and general observation. Closer in is the social zone, 4 to 12 feet, the realm of formal business, interviews, and casual gatherings. Then the critical line is crossed into the personal zone, 1.5 to 4 feet. This is where friendly conversations happen, where intimacy begins to register, and where your vigilance naturally increases. Finally, there is the intimate zone, 0 to 18 inches. This zone is reserved for lovers, confidants, and combatants. To enter it without permission is an act of trust or an act of aggression. Mastery of this psychological law is not about understanding these definitions. It is about deliberately respecting or transgressing these boundaries to achieve a specific psychological effect. Imagine you are seated across a large boardroom table. You feel stable, cognitively alert, buffered by the 6 feet of mahogany and air, the standard social zone. Now imagine a high-status individual, a seasoned negotiator, or an intimidating CEO, doesn't sit. Instead, they walk around the table during a critical moment and lean in, placing their hands on the wood precisely where the social zone gives way to the personal zone, less than 2 feet from your face. They haven't touched you, but your physiology has changed immediately. Your biological defense system pulls resources from complex cognitive processing, logic, abstract thought, creative problem solving, and diverts them to basic vigilance and self-protection. You are momentarily handicapped. You are now subconsciously reacting to their proximity, not their argument. This is the central mechanism of psychological leverage through proxemics, subtle dominance. The powerful know that they can unilaterally reduce the distance between 2 people and force the lower status individual to either accept the intrusion, thus ceding ground, or retreat, physically confirming their subordinate position. The goal is to enforce vulnerability. They utilize this spatial pressure to momentarily destabilize your rational mind, turning a cognitive debate into a primal test of boundaries. The inverse technique is equally potent: manufactured intimacy. A deliberate momentary breach of the intimate zone, often coupled with a low whisper or a non-aggressive touch. The brief placement of a hand on your forearm, the shared, secretive lean into a small space, forces a rush of connection. It bypasses the slow, methodical process of building trust and instantly creates the sensation of shared vulnerability. You may have just met them, but the forced proximity tricks your ancient brain into believing, just for a moment, that this person belongs inside your most protected space. This immediate, intense connection can be leveraged as trust, making you significantly more susceptible to suggestion. In your daily life, proxemics is the ultimate social thermometer. Watch the person who stands a foot closer than is culturally normal for your conversation, forcing you to subtly lean backward, always controlling the dynamic of approach and retreat. Notice the difference in presence when someone stands rigidly, staking claim to their personal zone, versus the person who folds their arms tightly, minimizing their spatial footprint, signaling deference or anxiety. When you understand that power allows you to define the spatial rules, you can consciously choose to hold the boundary firmly when authority is required, or deliberately and carefully breach it when immediate, intense rapport is needed. The deeper psychological insight is this: Your sense of personal space is not an inherent right. It is a constantly negotiated social construct. You realize that your environment is not static. It is a flowing, dynamic river of boundaries that are continually being tested, subtly shifted, or outright ignored by those seeking psychological advantage. When you become consciously aware of these invisible negotiations, you gain control over the most fundamental aspect of your interactions. True power is not about filling the room with noise or grand gestures. It is about controlling the subtle, measured distance between your presence and their core. Learn to read the space. The space between two people is never empty. It is saturated with potential, waiting for the one who understands its silent language to define the rules of engagement. The vacuum of unexpressed need. There is a strange and unsettling phenomenon that governs the distribution of power in every relationship, a deep psychological law we rarely discuss because its consequences are so intimate and often painful. We call this the vacuum of unexpressed need. Why is it that despite giving so much of your energy, your patience, your time, you often feel not just empty but actively depleted, occasionally resentful? It is not the act of giving that drains you. It is the expectation that floats in the silence, the invisible unilateral contract you signed with yourself demanding reciprocation that the other party never agreed to, nor was ever informed of. This fundamental law states that any genuine, profound human requirement, be it emotional validation, tangible help, recognition of effort, or clearly defined boundaries, that remains deliberately unarticulated creates an exponentially increasing psychological pressure, a void, a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, but the human psyche abhors a vacuum even more profoundly. This void will inevitably be filled either by destructive internal narratives like self-pity and simmering resentment, or far more dangerously, by external actors seeking to establish leverage. Power, in its most insidious form, often flows immediately into the space where clarity refuses to exist. To illustrate this, imagine your closest bond, a friendship, a marriage, a long-term professional partnership, as a closed system, a pressurized cabin operating under its own rules. Inside this cabin, you hold the hidden oxygen tank of your personal requirements: appreciation, fidelity, dedicated time. If you seal that tank shut, relying entirely on the other person's supposed empathy or telepathy to notice the rapidly diminishing air supply, the pressure differential between your internal, critical need and the external, unaware reality becomes explosive. They don't know the air is thinning. They only register your sudden, often disproportionate, emotional collapse or outburst when the oxygen runs out completely. They are blindsided, and you are left vulnerable, having leveraged your own silence against yourself. The mechanism of the vacuum is built upon a paradox. We confuse the difficulty of articulation with the nobility of silence. We avoid stating the need. I require structured time alone on Thursdays. I need concrete acknowledgement for that project. This joke crossed a serious line because we fear the word no. We fear the vulnerability of asking. But by actively refusing to ask, we ensure the need remains unmet, transferring the burden of our emotional fulfillment onto the other person's impossible capacity for mind reading. For those who practice the dark arts of interpersonal dynamics, the vacuum of unexpressed need is not a flaw. It is a meticulously observed blueprint for influence. They don't have to guess what you truly desire. They wait for your silence to weaken you, observing the precise moment your unspoken requirement becomes a critical vulnerability, a starvation state, when you are starving for acknowledgement. A manipulator doesn't bring you a feast. They wait until your internal pressure reaches peak capacity, and then they fill the vacuum not with what you deeply need, but with the smallest, most performative gesture that relieves your immediate psychological suffering. They offer a single crumb of validation, earning maximum influence and loyalty for minimum genuine investment. They exploit the starvation. Look at your modern life, your career path, your scrolling habits. When you silently crave professional recognition, an astute manager, aware of this law, will rarely rush to praise you immediately. They let the vacuum grow, knowing that when they finally offer that small delayed nod of approval, its psychological currency is amplified tenfold against your pre-existing hunger. In the digital world, the incessant search for external validation is precisely the vacuum we try to fill with likes and followers. But because the underlying need is never articulated, never defined as, I need to feel seen for my competence, not my consumption, the superficial fix only expands the underlying cavernous void. Understanding the vacuum is fundamentally recognizing that ownership of your desire is the first step toward reclaiming your power. When you fail to articulate your limitations, your boundaries, or your requirements, you implicitly grant others the power to define those parameters for you. This law forces a brutal shift away from the passive position of deserving toward the active position of stating and negotiating. The deepest philosophical realization here is this: silence, particularly the silence surrounding fundamental needs, is not strength. It is an open invitation for others to project their own agenda, their own desires, their own limitations, onto the empty space of your unstated self. The price of keeping your genuine emotional requirements hidden is always, without exception, paid in the currency of resentment, depletion, and eventual surgical manipulation. Stop waiting for the acknowledgement you haven't requested. The vacuum takes infinitely more than it gives. The most profound psychological maneuver you can execute is not to dominate others, but to refuse to be defined by them. This is the law of cognitive retreat, asserting psychological extraterritoriality. Have you ever felt the subtle, suffocating weight of a story you didn't write, yet are expected to perform until your final scene? We are born into narratives, historical, familial, cultural, and these narratives assign us immediate, often reductive roles: the perpetually loyal one, the flawed artistic temperament, the chronic victim, or the compliant achiever. Psychological extraterritoriality isn't physical escape. It is the radical realization that your deepest self, your core operating system, exists outside the jurisdiction of external judgment, external expectation, or emotional blackmail. It is the moment you declare that the emotional borders of your soul are sovereign, regardless of the claims others try to stake on your identity. To understand its power, imagine the world as a vast, meticulously planned stage set. Everyone around you is reading their script, shouting their lines, desperate for you to follow the cues they were taught. You hold your unique, authentic potential, your own private script, but they insist it doesn't match the master plot they were given. The refusal isn't leaving the stage, it's staying exactly where you are, setting your required script down, and improvising a truth so authentic and so self-contained that it disrupts the entire performance. This disruption is the act of refusing the emotional gravity well that tries to pull you back into the orbit of their dysfunction or their predefined limitations. The central conflict lies in the social contract itself. Society demands coherence. It desperately needs you to fit a recognizable, manageable category, so it knows how to handle you, how to market to you, and how to predict your moves. When you refuse the narrative, when you step out of the character of the eternally helpful fixer, the chronically anxious high achiever, or the person who always buckles under pressure, you create a vacuum of expectation. This void terrifies people because your refusal highlights, by contrast, their own psychological bondage to the roles they are still desperately performing. The deepest, most subtle mechanism of manipulation is not to force you into a new, unfamiliar role, but to reinforce a detrimental or limiting narrative you already secretly believe about yourself. They don't have to push you. They just have to gently remind you of the character you've played for years, the one who always hesitates, the one who always apologizes first, the one who believes they don't deserve the win. To achieve cognitive sovereignty, you must identify and incinerate the emotional leverage points others use, the familiar hooks of guilt, the weight of obligation, and the ancient fear of social isolation. When those hooks dissolve, their narrative about you loses all structural integrity. Look at the modern emotional economy. We are constantly being fed scripts via endless algorithms and meticulously curated feeds, scripts of perfection, scripted outrage, manufactured inadequacy, or artificial urgency. Your time, your attention, and crucially, your internal emotional stability are the resources being harvested. When you refuse the narrative of outrage, you become impossible to bait. When you refuse the narrative of urgency, you become immune to arbitrary pressure. Your non-reaction, your centered stillness in the face of manufactured drama, becomes the ultimate quiet act of sabotage against systems built entirely on exploiting reactivity. This realization radically shifts your psychological center of gravity. You cease to be a puppet reacting to stimuli engineered solely to pull you off balance. You internalize the understanding that your deepest, most enduring value comes not from successful participation in the external drama, no matter how loud or important it seems, but from an unwavering commitment to your internal, self-validated reality. The moment you define your boundaries, not merely as defensive walls against incoming harm, but as positive, defining markers of your own inviolable psychological territory, you transition from being merely a character in the story, dictated by the demands of others, to becoming the author of the story's meaning. This is true psychological power, precisely because it is non-coercive and generated entirely from within. When the world insists you are merely a pawn on its board, assert that you are the table upon which the game is played. Stop performing the limiting, exhausted stories they expect of you, and in that profound, sovereign silence, finally hear the only truth that matters, the deep, resonant hum of your own unwritten, untainted potential. If you reach this point, it means you don't run from the truth. Subscribe now. Stay close to what few dare to face. The weight of anticipated betrayal. There is a precise moment in certain critical relationships, a business partnership, a close friendship, or an intimate bond, when the emotional future crystallizes, not into hope, but into stark certainty. It is the chilling realization that the person across from you, the one you trusted or needed, is preparing to fail you, abandon you, or actively betray you. This is not the shock of the event itself. This is the psychological burden known as the Omen tax, paying the price before the disaster strikes. It is the immediate, non-refundable deposit you pay in stress, distrust, and vigilance, simply for anticipating a negative outcome from a trusted source. This is the art of psychological foresight when foresight only delivers sorrow. How much psychological currency do you spend defending yourself against failures and betrayals that haven't technically materialized yet? The Omen tax is the silent mechanism that extracts emotional labor before a single consequence has manifested. We understand financial prepayment. This is the equivalent in human connectivity. Think of a CEO who receives undeniable intelligence that a crucial business partner is insolvent and actively moving assets to hide the coming collapse. The company has not lost the money yet. The partner has not defaulted, but the CEO cannot afford to wait for the public announcement. Every single waking hour must now be spent restructuring contracts, auditing existing deals, and erecting firewalls against the inevitable contagion. The initial financial loss is predictable. The primary expenditure, the one draining energy and morale, is the sustained, preemptive labor of anticipation. You initiate this process whenever you sense the subtle inflection in tone, the missed call followed by the thin, overly detailed excuse, or the sudden, necessary omission of facts. You start documenting interactions, archiving emails, building a cold, objective narrative of justification for the eventual collapse, not for them, but for your own sanity. You are no longer operating in good faith. You are operating in defensive preparation, and this perhaps is the most profound betrayal of all, the one you enact upon the present moment. The paradox is brutal. In protecting your future self, you must first withdraw your true self from the current reality. you initiate the emotional separation necessary for survival, effectively betraying the existing intimacy to shield the future self from avoidable pain. This defensive posture, this emotional armor worn prematurely, is heavier than any actual disappointment could ever be. It siphons the energy that should fuel creation or connection and redirects it solely toward vigilance. You are not waiting for the bomb to go off. You are actively maintaining the perimeter, watching the clock, listening for the click of the timer, while trying to engage in casual conversation with the person who planted the device. You know the cost, and you are already paying the interest. This knowledge changes the very structure of your relationships, forcing you to shift your identity from a participant to an emotional auditor. The Omen tax dictates that you cannot fully commit to the present iteration of the relationship because a significant portion of your resources is reserved for the inevitable evacuation. You maintain distance, using half-truths, cautious replies, and non-committal planning. This creates a corrosive feedback loop. The distance you create defensively often confirms the initial suspicion of instability, or worse, hastens the failure, because the relationship can no longer withstand the weight of your distrust. The true damage of the Omen tax is not the stress of the waiting, it's the erosion of spontaneous, unguarded trust. Once you have seen the predictable pattern of human frailty, once you have learned to detect the signature of anticipated betrayal, the world ceases to feel like a place of shared, immediate experience. It becomes a series of strategic interactions requiring constant calibration. You gain foresight, you gain protection, but you lose the capacity for pure, unguarded joy in that connection. You become profoundly lonely in your knowledge. You cannot negotiate the interest rate on the Omen tax. The payment is non-negotiable and immediate. But you must ask yourself, is the shelter you build against the coming storm worth living in the darkness before the rain even starts? The moment you anticipate betrayal, you have already paid the price of solitude. The geometry of the strategic pause. The deepest anxiety in human interaction is the void, the chasm of silence that demands resolution. We are culturally trained to fill every gap, to reply instantly, to provide immediate closure, and in that reflexive urgency, we surrender all our leverage. Tonight, we examine the strategic pause, not as a byproduct of indecision, but as a deliberately engineered temporal weapon, the precise geometry of non-reaction. Have you ever felt that suffocating, anxious pressure to reply instantly to a challenge, a criticism, or a demand? That impulse, that frantic need to close the emotional loop, is your opponent's greatest tool against you. The strategic pause is the intentional delay, the creation of a deliberate temporal gap between stimulus and your eventual measured response. It is the moment you reclaim control over the clock of the interaction. In the world of psychological power, the person who dictates the rhythm owns the game. The relevance of this pause stems from our primal aversion to ambiguity. We instinctively rush to close gaps because silence implies threat, planning, or contempt. The master manipulator understands that these uncomfortable gaps are not empty spaces. They are the very architecture of dominance. Think of the pause not as a stop sign, but as the perfectly still lure cast upon dark water. Your opponent, whether a rival in business or a partner seeking an emotional commitment, casts their expectation, the challenge, the inquiry, and you simply let the line sit. You offer no movement, no tug, no confirmation. The fish, desperate for definition, for the expected action, begins to investigate. They move towards you. They commit their energy, their anxiety, into the silent space you created. Like the ancient matador, you do not rush the bull. You stand perfectly centered, forcing the opponent to define the entire trajectory of the attack against your stillness. The profound power of the strategic pause lies in its leveraging of the human horror of self-narration. When you are paused, unmoving, and your response is withheld, the other party is psychologically forced to perform all the emotional labor of the moment. Their minds immediately begin narrating the silence, always defaulting to the worst-case scenario. Did I offend them? Are they planning a devastating countermove? Am I being dismissed outright? The void becomes a canvas upon which they project their own internal fears, insecurities, and assumptions. This mechanism forces the opposition to negotiate not with you, but against themselves. The tension of the interaction shifts entirely from you, who should reply, to them, who must now wait and endure the psychological vacuum. This is the geometry. By holding your position, you force the other party into an exposed, unstable orbit around your core stillness. Apply this principle to the feverish pace of modern life, where urgency is confused with importance. Every instant reaction, the immediate text message reply, the 5-minute email response, serves only to signal your availability and, critically, your eagerness to please or to defend. When you employ the strategic pause before replying to a high-stakes communication, you imply a deep, undeniable importance. You are not instantly accessible because you are either too busy or you are processing their demands with a level of rigor that suggests they might have gravely miscalculated the situation. Use the intentional delay, the temporal weapon of the 48-hour or even the 3-day rule, not as procrastination, but as a systematic method to diminish the perceived urgency of their request and simultaneously amplify the gravity of your impending reply. You are demonstrating that you operate on your own timeline, which is inherently a timeline of greater consequence. What fundamentally changes when you integrate this geometry? You cease being a reactive, instinctual organism responding to external stimuli, and you become a deliberate architect of time and tension. You learn that your sustained silence, free of emotional baggage, is often louder and infinitely more revealing than any 1,000-word defense or explanation you might have offered. The deepest form of power is the power to deny engagement on demand, to refuse to be drawn into the frantic rhythm set by others. When you own the pause, you own the geometry of the entire interaction because you possess the gravity that pulls others toward your center. Do not rush to fill the vacuum of conversation or conflict in the sacred, unsaid space created by your stillness. The geometry of power always favors the one who waits. The silence is not empty. It is a profound vacuum, pregnant with possibility, waiting only for your opponent to exhaust themselves defining its shape. The illusion of zero-sum negotiation. Tonight we delve into the cognitive anchor that keeps 90% of the world locked in perpetual struggle. The illusion of zero-sum negotiation, what we might call the scarcity trap. Why is it that even when you achieve a clear victory, you feel strangely hollow, strangely drained? Why does every acquisition, every step up the ladder, feel tainted by the necessary subtraction from someone else? This is not morality whispering to you. This is the residual psychological cost of buying into a false premise. You have been trained to see the world as a fixed pie. The zero-sum fallacy, ZSF, is the deeply ingrained belief that value, whether it is power, money, status, or even happiness, is a finite, static quantity. Therefore, any gain realized by entity A must necessitate an equal corresponding loss by entity B. This is primal economics, rooted in the survival thinking of hunting and gathering, where the carcass you claimed was one the neighboring tribe could not. It is efficient for rapid calculation, but catastrophic for complex strategy. The amateur manipulator thrives on your adherence to the ZSF because it dramatically simplifies the negotiation space. If you believe the pie cannot grow, you will fight relentlessly over the existing crumbs. Consider the classic illustration, the tale of the orange peel. Two individuals are fighting bitterly over a single orange. After a prolonged antagonistic negotiation rooted entirely in zero-sum principles, who is stronger, who deserves it more, they reluctantly agree to a 50-50 split, a purely zero-sum outcome. They walk away feeling vaguely triumphant, yet profoundly unsatisfied. The first person wanted the peel to bake a cake, discarding the flesh. The second person wanted the flesh for juice, discarding the peel, because they defined the resource as one orange, a single unified variable, and not as pulp and rind, two distinct divisible variables. They achieved a perfectly equal distribution of dissatisfaction. They solved the wrong problem. The true mechanism of power here is not how you divide the resource, but how you define the resource. The skilled strategist, the master of manipulation, understands that almost nothing in human complexity is purely zero-sum. They work tirelessly to restrict your definition of value. They anchor you to the single, obvious currency, the price, the timeline, the specific title, while secretly seeking out the non-obvious, non-competitive variables. Future access, proprietary information, leverage over a third party, or perhaps simply the psychological gratification of being seen as the winner. They create a narrow competitive arena to exhaust you, ensuring you are too weary to look for the dimensions where value can be created rather than merely extracted. This plays out daily in your modern life. Think of a toxic relationship negotiation, where one person demands space and the other interprets this as a zero-sum subtraction of control. They enter a desperate negotiation over time spent together when the underlying non-competitive variables might be security for one and autonomy for the other. These goals are not mutually exclusive. They are often complementary, but the zero-sum illusion forces them into direct conflict. We cripple our relationships, our careers, and our mental health by unconsciously importing the laws of the fixed market into the infinite ecosystem of human potential. The deepest philosophical shift required is moving your focus from transaction, what is exchanged, to architecture, how the exchange itself is structured. When you reject the zero-sum illusion, you escape the competitive mindset that generates fear, chronic resentment, and a constant energy-draining state of alert. You realize that true power is not the ability to take the whole pie, but the cognitive ability to discover and invent entirely new pies. The highest form of manipulation is not forcing a loss, but orchestrating a win-win scenario where your inherent leverage ensures your win is exponential, stable, and often intangible. You shift from competitor to architect. The illusion of scarcity is the most expensive luxury you indulge in. Real power doesn't hoard. Real power creates. Stop fighting for half an orange. Start asking what the other person intends to bake. The ultimate law of leverage. Never settle for taking a fixed slice when you know how to build the entire bakery. The burden of undeserved transparency. The law of exhausted utility. When trust becomes a weapon against you. Have you ever felt utterly drained after confessing a deeply personal fear or revealing a quiet ambition, only to realize the listener didn't truly care, or worse, they filed that vulnerability away for later use, a quiet ammunition you never intended to provide? It's the silent, nauseating anxiety of being seen too clearly before the relationship earned the vision, the emotional fatigue of having given away a psychological piece of yourself that was not met with equal investment. This is the burden of undeserved transparency. Undeserved transparency is the premature surrender of your psychological shield. It is the tactical error of conflating speed with depth, mistaking the immediate relief of confession for the establishment of genuine intimacy. We live in an era where authenticity is constantly monetized and radical transparency is preached as the ultimate moral good, a societal balm for mistrust. But the art of strategic psychological power demands a rigorous, almost ruthless opacity. Transparency, when given too freely and without requiring the recipient to invest genuine time or emotional currency, ceases to be an act of meaningful bonding and becomes a debilitating liability, a documented weakness filed under potential leverage by others. The context is critical. The true value of a personal secret or a profound vulnerability is not in its content, but in its exclusivity. Once distributed freely, its value collapses, often taking your perceived social standing along with it. Consider your inner life not as an open meadow inviting passers-by, but as a heavily fortified bank vault, secured by layers of steel and sophisticated mechanisms. People request access, seeking glimpses of your true net worth, your insecurities, your desires, your past mistakes, the history of your character. When you offer the combination lock and the key card before they even present a valid account number, before they have proven their trustworthiness by consistent, reciprocal investment, you haven't fostered immediate trust. You have merely demonstrated a dangerous lack of security protocol. They leave the vault feeling nothing but the knowledge that they could break back in easily should the need arise, and you are left standing guard over nothing but echoes and dust. The core mechanism of the burden is the tragic miscalculation of emotional debt. You mistakenly believe that by showing your faults and your scars first, you preempt criticism and earn automatic reciprocal honesty. But this is the psychological trap. When you reveal a profound flaw or a secret sadness to someone who hasn't invested the necessary time or empathy to appreciate the weight of that truth, they don't see courage or authenticity. They see low social valuation and an eagerness to please. You have handed them a powerful, complex tool, the blueprint to your emotional architecture, and they don't have the maturity or, frankly, the right to handle it. They are instantly elevated above you, not by their own merit, but by your unnecessary disclosure. The tension lies in the crushing realization that your transparency was meant to forge a deeper, stronger bond, yet it merely created an immediate and persistent power imbalance where you are perpetually the emotional debtor, hoping they won't cash the check you wrote them. Observe this principle in the chaos of modern communication, from online dating profiles to initial professional networking meetings. We utilize detailed life stories, trauma dumps, and immediate, exhaustive self-critiques as emotional icebreakers, attempting to shortcut the arduous, slow-burn process of earned intimacy. But the typical result is the phenomenon of sudden withdrawal or the silence of ghosting. The recipient feels overwhelmed, cheapened by the sheer volume of unearned heavy data, and retreats into self-preservation. You tried to build a permanent monument on a foundation laid in 5 rushed minutes, you confusing the simple transfer of information with the deeply intricate wiring of true emotional connection. The long-term psychological impact of this strategy is a gradual, chilling sense of perpetual exposure, often leading to paranoia. You start viewing yourself through the critical, judgmental eyes of all those who hold your scattered truths, becoming perpetually defensive, brittle, and hesitant in new interactions. This self-imposed burden shifts your cognitive focus from mastering your own reality to constantly managing the outside perception of the flaws that you so willingly distributed. You sacrifice the essential psychological mystery that fuels sustained attraction, commands respect, and maintains long-term fascination. Your precious emotional energy is now dedicated not to growth, but to trying to close the myriad doors you never should have opened in the first place. Never forget, true, sustainable power resides not in the exhaustive record of what you reveal, but in the calculated, compelling weight of what you strategically withhold. Let your mystery be the hard-won payment they must earn, not the cheap, discarded gift you offer to apologize for your own complex, powerful existence. The deep comfort of predictable patterns. We call this the law of cognitive economy. Have you ever noticed how the most exhausting part of any journey isn't the distance traveled, but the constant need to make new, conscious decisions? When you know exactly what is coming next, when the path is entirely worn and certain, doesn't a profound, almost luxurious calm wash over you? This is the core mechanism of the predictable pattern. The brain is not designed for endless creativity. It is a meticulous, ruthless accountant of energy. Uncertainty, cognitive dissonance, the need to weigh 2 complex options, these are metabolic drains. The law of cognitive economy states that the mind will relentlessly seek out and reinforce patterns that reduce processing load, often prioritizing efficiency and speed over accuracy or novelty. This is the bedrock of habit. It is why we fall into routine so quickly, and why breaking those routines feels physically painful. It's not a moral failure, it's a systemic energy crisis. Consider your morning ritual. You perform dozens of micro-actions before 8 a.m., the exact grip on the coffee mug, the precise path through the house, the habitual check of the same apps in the same order. None of these require real thought. Your frontal cortex is essentially outsourced to your basal ganglia. You have achieved flow state through repetition, a zero-friction existence for that small window of time. This state is not freedom, it is elegant programming. It's the difference between navigating a familiar forest path blindfolded and charting a new coastline in a storm. The familiar path is predictable, therefore it is safe, even if it leads you perpetually in circles. The deep somatic comfort you feel is the relief of energy conservation. You are telling your internal system, rest, the threat assessment is complete. Here is the psychological leverage. Once a predictable pattern is established, the system becomes highly sensitive to interruption or, critically, highly resistant to deviation. This comfort, this cognitive economy, is the very lever of subtle manipulation. Think of the psychological principle known as the foot in the door technique. It succeeds because the initial small request fits seamlessly into your predictable pattern of compliance or routine action. It saves you the energy of saying no and justifying that deviation. You say yes, not out of profound commitment, but out of cognitive laziness. The pattern is already set for minor compliance, and the friction required to break that inertia is too great for your economizing mind to invest. You are comfortable, and the moment you prioritize comfort over vigilance, you become programmable. The cost of breaking a predictable pattern is measured not in dollars, but in units of cognitive pain. Look at the architecture of the modern digital world. Algorithms thrive on maximizing predictable patterns of engagement. They don't want you to think or choose. They want you to scroll, react, and return at precise, reinforcing intervals. They are simply building comfort loops, a series of small, predictable rewards delivered with metabolic precision. They feed you exactly what confirms your pattern of belief, not what challenges it. This deepens your predictability, making you an easier mark for targeted persuasion. In your own relationships, notice how quickly you establish emotional scripts. When your partner behaves predictably, even negatively, it is less stressful than genuine disruptive volatility. You may complain about their predictability, but you secretly rely on it to budget your emotional energy. You know where the landmines are, and navigating a known battlefield is always easier than facing an unknown front. The profound impact is this: the quest for comfort through predictability traps you in cycles of mediocrity. You build fences around your potential in the name of safety. To truly wield power, or to genuinely disrupt your own path, you must learn to tolerate high levels of cognitive friction. You must deliberately choose the path that demands energy, the decision that slows you down, the thought that forces you to build a new map. The predictability you crave is a subtle form of stagnation, a quiet surrender to external programming, because the internal labor of conscious creation is simply too demanding for the brain's accountant. You must periodically sabotage your own patterns. You must force yourself into the exhausting clarity of uncertainty, if only to remind the system that you, not the routine, are still the architect of your effort. Know this: the most predictable lives are the easiest to manage, and therefore the easiest to control. Your comfort is their efficiency. The art of forgetting what was revealed. The law of deliberate unknowing is the silence after the insight, the immediate psychological transaction where you trade clarity for comfort. Have you ever seen something so clearly? A vulnerability so exposed, a pattern of manipulation so perfectly executed, that the only way to keep functioning within that relationship or system was to instantly pretend you hadn't. You realize the game, you see the wires, you identify the lever being pulled, and the overwhelming subsequent effort isn't dedicated to fighting the revelation, but in consciously burying the evidence of your own sight. This is not simple repression. It is active, tactical, psychological self-censorship deployed the moment awareness threatens survival. We are defining the point where knowledge becomes a profound liability rather than an asset. When you know too much about the structure of the game, when the rules of engagement are laid bare, acknowledging that knowledge, even internally, destabilizes your entire world. It is the deep paradox of the red pill. The truth is toxic, corrosive, and lethal unless you immediately find a way to metabolically neutralize it. The most potent illustration of deliberate unknowing happens in high-stakes human architecture, whether that is a complex negotiation, a long-term partnership, or a corporate hierarchy. There is a precise instant when the curtain slips and you see the core emotional pressure point that is being exploited, the cynical mechanism driving the other person's behavior. It is an instant flash of uncomfortable, cold clarity, like seeing the structural faults in the foundation of the house you live in. But here is the critical choice. The moment you signal that you have seen the wiring, the performance stops. The facade shatters, and the relationship as it exists is instantly over. To continue the deal, to maintain the peace, or to keep the shared illusion intact, you must perform the act of being perfectly fooled. You must, in one swift, silent motion, put the mask back on the manipulator, and crucially, put the blindfold back on yourself. Why do we choose to forget what was revealed? Because true, actionable knowledge demands immediate, consequential action. If you know, with absolute certainty, that you are being strategically undervalued, you are morally compelled to leave, and leaving is messy and expensive. If you know the system surrounding you is fundamentally unfair, rigged, or corrupt, you are forced into the excruciating choice between fighting it, which guarantees exhaustion, or collapsing under the weight of the injustice. Deliberate unknowing is the third silent option. It allows you to retain the operational intelligence, the subtle, subconscious truth that guides your defensive movements, while jettisoning the conscious, emotionally destructive fact. It is the ultimate psychological efficiency maneuver. Use the information to protect yourself laterally without paying the immediate emotional cost of confronting the truth teller or destroying the structure. The conflict is waged silently between intellectual honesty and emotional day-to-day survival. This tactical amnesia is omnipresent in modern life. Think about scrolling through the curated reality of social media, seeing the perfect, stylized performance of happiness or success. You know intellectually that it is constructed, optimized, and often hollow, designed to elicit a specific envious response. Yet, to enjoy the feed, to feel the comforting warmth of consensus reality, you participate willingly in the deliberate unknowing. You agree to believe the illusion for the duration of the scroll. We apply this tactical amnesia to our professional environments, where we ignore the flaws of the leadership, to our families, where we ignore inherited traumas, and to our political structures, where we overlook glaring contradictions, all just to manage the sheer, paralyzing volume of inconvenient reality. The deep psychological impact of this forgetting is the establishment of a secret, robust partition within the self. There is the observing self, the one that knows the dark patterns, the manipulations, and the systemic flaws. And there is the functional, social self that performs blissful, manageable ignorance. The unexpected strength of the manipulated person is not their eventual resistance, but their honed ability to compartmentalize the shattering revelation. This is precisely what allows power structures, unequal relationships, and uncomfortable contracts to persist. The willing, surgical ignorance of those who recognize their own operational powerlessness to change the structure they are forced to inhabit. The most powerful choice we make, therefore, is often not the knowledge we seek, but the truths we master, the ability to forget. The forgotten truth is often the heaviest, darkest burden you continue to lift, day after silent, strategic day. The decisive grace of not knowing everything, the strategic vacuum, the law of necessary ambiguity. How many times have you destroyed a perfect moment, a powerful position, simply because you felt the unbearable, gnawing need to know the exact answer? That need for closure is not wisdom. It is often a psychological Achilles heel, a vulnerability that others, consciously or unconsciously, will use to drain your influence. Pause here, breathe deeply, and consider this. Certainty is rarely a tool of true power. It is usually a psychological expense. This is the decisive grace of not knowing everything. It is the recognition that absolute certainty, while seemingly desirable, often acts as a friction mechanism, slowing your movement and exposing your weaknesses. Knowledge is power, yes, but too much localized. Defined knowledge often locks you into predictable, rigid patterns. making you easy to read and easier to counter. Strategic ambiguity, the intentional maintenance of an informational vacuum, forces the rest of the world to fill that space with their own projections, their own deep-seated fears, and consequently, their own psychological energy. It is about controlling the frame by refusing to draw the final line. Think of the master sculptor, not when the statue is finished and displayed under bright lights, but when the piece is still partially concealed beneath the damp cloth. The finished form is impressive, yes, but the moment that truly captures the imagination, the moment that commands tension, is when the chisel marks suggest powerful, terrifying possibility rather than finality. The mystery holds the power. If you reveal the statue now, the potential collapses into the finite. If you keep the mystery, the potential expands infinitely in the minds of the observers. Consider the high-stakes negotiation where you refuse to state your absolute bottom line. The true power lies in the gap, not the boundary. If you reveal your exact financial limit, the negotiation collapses to a predictable game of marginal losses. But if you keep the limit implied but strategically undefined, your opponent is negotiating against their own internal ghosts, constantly second-guessing whether they have pushed too hard or left money on the table. You have leveraged their anxiety without expending any of your own capital. The core psychological mechanism at play here exploits the profound human terror of the unknown. Our minds are narrative engines. We vehemently abhor informational gaps or loose ends. When presented with a void, an unanswered question, an uncommitted expression, an undefined future action, the psyche rushes violently to fill it. Crucially, the mind almost always defaults to the worst-case scenario, or the scenario that is most personally threatening or disruptive to its sense of order. This involuntary filling of the gap is the source of your leverage. When you withhold definitive information, whether it be about your true resources, your ultimate commitment, or your exact next move, you are essentially outsourcing the hardest, most energy-draining part of the psychological battle to your opponent's own tireless anxiety loop. Your silence becomes louder than their desperate internal monologue, dominating the field of awareness. Observe how this strategy manifests in the social landscape, whether in dating, career advancement, or social media influence. The individual who constantly over-explains, who justifies every fleeting action, who insists on absolute immediate transparency, rapidly loses gravitational pull. They become flat, predictable, and tiresome. They offer no room for projection, no compelling mystery. Conversely, the individual who maintains a respectful but undeniable distance, a slight, intriguing opacity regarding their future plans or their full resources, compels curiosity, commands patience, and earns respect. In professional strategy, never allow your colleagues or your competitors to know the absolute limit of your ambition or the absolute floor of your tolerance. They will inevitably test what they can clearly see. Keep the ceiling of your potential invisible, forcing them to always respect the possibility that you have reserves they cannot account for. The profound grace in this psychological law is fundamentally internal. Choosing not to know everything liberates you from the crippling pressure of needing to control every single variable in a complex system. The pathological, modern need for total foresight and absolute risk management is an enormous psychological tax, exhausting your reserves. True strategic mastery involves recognizing the inherent chaos of the world and delegating some of that complexity to the environment itself, allowing chance, or the unpredictable actions of others, to dictate the unnecessary variables while you focus only on the essential, undefined nodes of power. You stop burning energy attempting to trace every single branch on the hypothetical decision tree. You focus instead on planting the essential seeds, and you trust the fog of your ambiguity to conceal the true size and scope of your growing forest. The decisive insight is this: the ultimate power resides not in the answer you finally decide to give, but in the profound, eloquent, and terrifying silence you command just before the answer is absolutely required. Find your psychological space in the strategically unknown. Let the mystery become the silent, relentless engine of your enduring influence. The finished product is inherently finite. The potential, held eternally in reserve, is infinite. The self-inflicted wounds of comparison. Take a deep breath. Quiet the noise for a moment. We are about to discuss one of the most destructive habits of the modern mind, a pattern so pervasive it acts as a low-grade toxin in your psychological system. The zero-sum fallacy of external validation. Have you ever noticed how often your deep-seated peace is contingent upon someone else's perceived failure? Or, conversely, how often your anxiety spikes when a peer, a colleague, or even a distant acquaintance achieves a clear, quantifiable milestone? This is not mere curiosity. This is the measurement trap asserting its dominance over your interior landscape. You are constantly scoring your life, but who wrote the rules for that scoreboard? Comparison is not simply a social quirk, it is a fundamental cognitive error. Deeply rooted in our evolutionary history, where hierarchy dictated survival, yet twisted by the hypervisibility of the digital age. In its purest form, social comparison theory suggests we evaluate our opinions and abilities by comparing ourselves to others. This serves a basic orientation function. But the dark, modern application of this law transforms necessary orientation into toxic, self-flagellating obsession. We stop seeking necessary context and start seeking definitive proof of our own inadequacy. We are seeking a benchmark that does not and cannot exist. Imagine yourself standing in a hall lined with parallel mirrors. One mirror reflects the entirety of your life, the effort, the mistakes, the invisible struggles, the compromises, the quiet moments of growth that others never saw. This is your three-dimensional reality. The mirror beside it, however, reflects only the polished, idealized competitor. It shows the destination, the trophy, the peak achievement, but surgically hides the grueling journey, the specific sacrifices, and the hidden costs. When you look into that second mirror, you are comparing your complex, chaotic 3D internal self, the whole iceberg, with the edited 2D external highlight reel, the tip of their iceberg. This setup guarantees failure, fueling a chronic dissatisfaction that is entirely self-manufactured. This reveals the core mechanism of the comparison wound. It forces you to shift your internal metric. Your system of value creation is built upon effort, alignment, personal mastery, and growth. These are the variables within your direct control. But comparison forces you to abandon these internal metrics and adopt an external standard based on status, possession, and perceived success. You trade the stable satisfaction of personal momentum for the volatile addiction of external approval. This is the moment you hand your psychological autonomy to external forces. You become responsive, reactive, and permanently subordinate to the achievements of others. Look around. The modern connection is undeniable. We live in the age of the perpetual scroll, the digital panopticon, where comparison is no longer casual or infrequent. It is mandatory, involuntary, and structurally embedded in the interface of consciousness. Every carefully constructed feed is a mechanism designed to generate the fear of missing out, which is simply comparison dressed in better marketing clothes. This systemic overexposure means that you are perpetually living on someone else's emotional script, constantly trying to reconcile the dissonance between your unfiltered reality and their filtered narrative. This is the definition of psychological exhaustion. The immediate impact of the comparison wound is the erosion of self-contained power. True, sustainable power requires clarity, focus, and ruthless protection of your energy. When you are comparing, you are dedicating vast cognitive resources to monitoring and internalizing data points that you cannot influence. You are substituting useful action in your own life for judgmental observation of someone else's. The philosophy is simple. When you seek external benchmarks, you implicitly agree that your inherent value is a gradient, shifting up or down based on the perceived success of those around you. This makes you strategically vulnerable. No manipulator needs to break you down when you are already doing the work yourself. The most profound realization in the journey toward self-mastery is that your value is not a gradient but a constant. Power resides not in the accumulation of external markers that exceed your neighbors, but in the complete removal of the need for those markers to validate your existence. You must reclaim your metrics. Your trajectory is unique, your timeline is non-negotiable, and your internal scoreboard is the only one that dictates true progress. The moment you stop borrowing light from the reflections of other ships is the exact moment you begin generating the luminosity required to chart your own course. Embrace your constant. Cease the comparison. Heal the self-inflicted wounds. The weaponization of vulnerability. The weaponization of vulnerability is the law that states, "What you show me you fear, I will inevitably use to control what you value." It is the ultimate psychological jujutsu, where the exposed emotional core of the subject becomes the primary grip handle for the operator. Have you ever felt that the moment you allowed someone truly inside, the walls you spent years building suddenly transformed into levers against you? The comfort of sharing your deepest shadow is often just the initial setup for psychological arbitrage. We seek connection through exposure, driven by the profound need to be seen and accepted. But you must realize that not everyone who listens is a trusted friend. Some are simply mapping the terrain for future conquest. In the intricate architecture of power dynamics, vulnerability is not an inherent virtue. It is context-dependent intelligence. The Dark Law recognizes that true vulnerability is the deliberate lowering of defenses around your primal foundational fears. Your fear of abandonment, your deep anxiety about insignificance, or your terror of catastrophic failure. A sophisticated manipulator does not waste energy attacking your superficial strengths or engaging in meaningless conflict. They precisely identify and exploit your confessed weaknesses. They treat vulnerability as the metadata of your soul, the detailed blueprint revealing exactly where you store your most precious, yet fragile, emotional assets. Consider this mental experiment. The ancient art of the siege. A massive fortress with thick stone walls is impervious to direct assault, perhaps standing for years against external bombardment. But the general leading the siege does not care about the stone. They care about the life source. If the general knows there is a hidden subterranean spring, the single point of water, the source of life for the defenders, and they manage to poison or block that spring, the external walls become irrelevant. Your deepest vulnerability is that hidden spring. It is the single crucial point of failure that, once compromised, forces total surrender and compliance, regardless of how strong or resilient your external personality appears to be. The profound paradox lies in the human, biological necessity for genuine connection. We are fundamentally wired to bond, and bonding requires trust, which in turn necessitates a degree of authentic disclosure. The manipulator understands and respects this biological imperative. They do not demand your secrets. They invite them by performing reciprocal vulnerability. They offer a small, manufactured weakness, a carefully curated flaw, or a minor historical misstep, creating a false echo of intimacy. You, compelled by reciprocity, respond by offering a real structural weakness, a current insecurity, a deep-seated fear. This engineered imbalance is the precise mechanism of weaponization. They gain the functional blueprint of your internal architecture, your shame, your insecurities, and the moment they need compliance, they don't threaten you externally. Instead, they press the internal button they know hurts you the most, administering subtle affirmations of your own self-doubt, forcing your internal conflict to do the heavy labor of controlling you. Look at modern emotional discourse. We are constantly encouraged, both socially and professionally, to be authentic, to share our journey, and to practice open communication. While this is often noble in intent, this public mandate for constant porous disclosure creates an environment absolutely ripe for exploitation. Online, your vulnerability becomes raw data points used to craft highly tailored influence campaigns. In close relationships, the person who knows your deepest shame or your greatest insecurity holds permanent non-negotiable leverage. If you confided to a partner, "I truly fear I'm fundamentally unlovable," the next significant argument will not remain about the dishes or the schedule. It will swiftly and insidiously morph into an implicit, devastating affirmation of that exact fear, administered with subtle cruelty to ensure emotional subordination. The realization that your emotional core can be leveraged and weaponized forces a difficult but necessary philosophical shift, the necessity of selective privacy. You must internalize that true strength lies not in broadcasting your pain to the world, but in choosing the extremely rare few who have genuinely earned the right, through long observed fidelity, to see the fragile foundations of your being. This shift is not about building defensive walls of denial. It is about constructing an inner sanctum protected by radical discernment. It fundamentally changes how you approach trust, transforming it from a hopeful, blind leap of faith into a calculated, deeply observed exchange of proven integrity. Be careful who you give the keys to your emotional safety deposit box. The difference between true connection and cold control is often just the distance between the fear you carelessly whispered and the opportunistic hand that holds the hammer. Remember this: vulnerability is tremendous power, but only when it is retained and strategically utilized by the self. Shared carelessly, it is merely ammunition reserved for the shadows waiting to be invited in. The loophole of emotional inertia. We move now to Block 26. A concept critical for understanding why the simplest changes often feel impossible: the loophole of emotional inertia. Have you ever watched a crucial moment slip away, not because you lacked ability, resources, or knowledge, but because the effort required to simply start felt heavier than the consequence of failing? That quiet, oppressive weight you feel when faced with a critical action, be it writing the email, making the call, or leaving the stagnant comfort of a known situation, is not weakness. It is a fundamental law of physics applied directly to your inner life. Emotional inertia is the psychological counterpart to Newton's first law. An emotional state, whether defined by profound anxiety, toxic avoidance, or simply dull contentment, will persist unless compelled to change by an external or a deliberate internal force. In the game of power, and especially in the high-stakes manipulation of self, this inertia is both your most reliable shield and your deepest vulnerability. It dictates how long you will tolerate discomfort, how slowly you react to threat, and how easily others can predict your eventual plateau. We often mistake comfort for stability and manic reaction for momentum, when in reality, both can be sophisticated forms of deeply entrenched psychological stillness. To grasp the magnitude of this challenge, imagine a massive, silent cargo ship floating dead in the water. It carries the cumulative weight of everything you have postponed: unmade decisions, unresolved conflicts, anxiety that has become the default engine hum of your waking consciousness. To stop this ship, you need immense reverse thrust. Critically, to start it, you need immense initial energy to overcome the immediate resistance of the water. That initial, agonizing requirement is the inertia barrier. Your problem isn't steering, planning, or mapping the destination. The problem is generating the initial friction required to get the propeller to turn even a single degree against the stagnant resistance you are sitting in. The paradox of the loophole is this: we are socially conditioned to believe that breaking negative inertia requires a proportional, heroic effort, a total life overhaul, a dramatic confrontation, an overnight commitment to discipline. But that overwhelming magnitude of effort is precisely what the inertia uses to paralyze you. The inertia whispers, if you cannot do it perfectly, do not bother starting at all. The loophole is the quiet, almost deceitful realization that the initial resistance is purely volumetric, not kinetic. You don't need to move the entire ship. You only need to trigger a tiny, high-leverage system that bypasses the full weight of the resistance. The most effective manipulation here is often self-manipulation. You must trick your mind into treating the impossible, mountain-sized task as merely a 5-minute setup for something else. The loophole is the strategic adoption of minimum viable action. a commitment designed purely to shift the emotional baseline, not to solve the problem instantly. Look closely at your own life right now. You are stuck, not because you cannot file the taxes, but because the emotional inertia around the thought of organizing the documents is too great. You are stuck, not because you cannot finally leave the toxic relationship, but because the inertia of the known, even painful discomfort, is easier to maintain than the perceived chaotic energy of the unknown freedom. Inertia thrives on global objectives and vague intentions. It dies when confronted with local, time-bound, nearly insignificant commitments. The current era rewards the illusion of frantic busyness, which is often just high-speed emotional inertia, motion without true direction, a complex and sophisticated way of remaining perpetually stuck. Recognizing this psychological law grants you a lethal edge in self-governance. It means the true enemy is never the task itself, but the energy required to initiate the very first movement. Once movement begins, once that inertia is broken, even minutely, the law works for you. Momentum becomes your most powerful fuel, a self-sustaining engine. The immediate goal is never to solve the entire problem. The immediate goal is to create just enough internal friction to generate the spark of initial motion. Understand this. Your mind fundamentally prefers certainty, even the certainty of prolonged suffering, to the raw, uncontrolled uncertainty of decisive action. Your power lies in forcing the system into that uncertainty by making the required initial decision functionally smaller than the cognitive cost of avoiding it any longer. Do not seek the strength to move the mountain. Seek only the audacity to roll a single pebble. For in the cold, clear physics of the mind, the greatest resistance is always overcome by the smallest, most intentional shift. Emotional inertia is a powerful anchor, but the loophole is simply remembering. You are not tethered to the weight. You are tethered only to the decision not to move. Framing the failure as foundational myth. The Mythic Retcon. This is the art of transforming irreversible defeat into the necessary precursor for your current success. Think about the deepest failure you've ever experienced, that one moment that still catches your breath, the memory you revisit in the quietest hours. Why, after all this time, do you refuse to truly bury it? You keep it close not because you are weak, but because you instinctively understand its immense narrative power. You are not just remembering a failure, you are polishing a foundational myth. This is the psychological mechanism where you retroactively assign monumental, almost divine meaning to your most devastating errors. It's the subtle but profound difference between saying, "I failed," and saying, "The path required that I be broken here, so that I could be reforged into this specific configuration." This isn't self-help platitude. It's a profound act of self-sovereignty, a strategic rewriting of your own history designed to guarantee the psychological stability of your present achievements. It gives your journey a trajectory, moving it from a series of random accidents to a predetermined destiny. Consider the classic Silicon Valley or entrepreneurial narrative. No billion-dollar founder is ever genuinely celebrated for the smooth, linear ascent. They are celebrated for the near-death experience, the version 1.0 crash, the bankruptcy filing they fought off in court, the partnership that betrayed them, the 6 years they spent sleeping on a broken couch, eating nothing but instant ramen. The failure isn't a footnote, it is the crucible. It is the moment the protagonists received their defining wound, the wound that later granted them insights and resilience that no cushioned journey could ever offer. This is the structure of every enduring myth, from Oedipus to Odysseus to the CEO you idolize. The hero must first be humbled, broken, or exiled before they can return with authority. When you adopt this frame, you stop having mistakes and start having necessary sacrifices. The power dynamic inherent in this act is immense. When you successfully frame your failure as a foundational myth, you are inoculating yourself against future critique. You seize control of the narrative of your own fragility. If someone tries to bring up your past mistake, the bad investment, the public embarrassment, the failed marriage, you disarm them instantly. Why? because you already own that narrative. You packaged it, polished it, and presented it as the single greatest proof of your character and the source code of your current wisdom. The paradox is revealing. Genuine, painful humility is leveraged to build unshakable authority. You market vulnerability as strength, rendering your resilience impossible to deny. You are saying, I have been to that depth and I returned stronger. You cannot scare me with the darkness I already navigated. Look at how you tell stories about relationships that ended badly. Are they merely mistakes, or are they described as necessary teachers, painful lessons that prepared you for the clarity you hold now? If you truly embrace this framing, your current relationship, your career choice, or even your pursuit of knowledge becomes the inevitable outcome of a previous necessary sacrifice. You stop living through random events and start living through prophecy fulfilled. This psychological determinism is the ultimate power tool. The ultimate psychological impact of this reframing is absolute control over perceived destiny. By anchoring your present identity in a mythologized past, you make your current success feel predetermined, inevitable. You transform chaos into divine personal order. This isn't just surviving failure, it's demanding that failure serve you. It turns trauma into a strategic resource, a credential proving your worthiness. It gives you the quiet, internal certainty that you have already paid the necessary price required by the universe or by fate for everything you now possess. It allows you to wear your scars as history, not just as damage. Failure is unavoidable, but being defined by failure, that remains the single greatest act of narrative negligence you can commit against yourself. You must decide today what myth the ruins of yesterday will tell. And in that silence, after the myth is fully accepted, you find your truest, most enduring form of power. The silent treaty with your own darkness. This is the law of integration of the shadow, the utility of acceptance. Why is it that the moment you try to violently destroy your worst habit or suppress your most cynical instinct, it seems to gain absolute consuming control over you? Because the internal war itself is the fuel. You are expending energy fighting against a force you already own, guaranteeing its endurance. We spend our entire lives building fortified psychological walls against the parts of ourselves we deem unacceptable, the aggression, the envy, the sheer, paralyzing laziness, the manipulative streak that occasionally surfaces when the stakes are high. This law proposes that true psychological and strategic power is achieved not by attempting the impossible task of eliminating the shadow, but by negotiating a sustainable, silent treaty with it. This is the profound difference between living in a state of constant, exhausting internal warfare and establishing a functional, if tense, alliance with your entire self. We must first contextualize the shadow not as a moral failing, but as a reservoir of psychological resource. These dark instincts are often merely underdeveloped survival mechanisms, raw, unrefined energy that society has trained you to shame. They are the capacity for necessary ruthlessness. If you deny your capacity for aggression, you cannot set firm boundaries. If you deny your capacity for cynicism, you become a naive target. If you deny your desire for power, you surrender agency. The silent treaty begins with acceptance, acknowledging that every human being carries this dark potential, and that your strength lies in its management, not its abolition. Now imagine your darkness not as a monster, but as a massive, immensely powerful engine housed deep within the hull of your vessel. For years, you've been taught that this engine is inherently evil, and you have tried everything to flood the chamber, chain the pistons, or jam the gears. You have failed, and in failing, you have wasted vast reserves of vital operational energy. The silent treaty is realizing that if you learn to adjust the throttle, if you allow that raw engine to run quietly at 10%, you can harness its immense, untamed torque for silent, irresistible forward movement. The moment you try to switch it off entirely, it backfires, creating an unpredictable, explosive surge that burns the whole system down and forces you into reactionary, panicked decision-making. The mechanism here is paradoxical. The moment you stop hating your own ruthlessness, you gain the precise control needed to utilize that ruthlessness strategically and sparingly. Suppression makes the dark side unpredictable, volatile, and prone to sudden, uncontrolled bursts of expression. Integration makes it a sharpened tool waiting patiently in the shed, ready to be deployed by a conscious will, not an unconscious eruption. Consider the components of this necessary darkness. Your capacity for anger provides the clearest possible signal that a boundary has been violated. Your envy, often disguised as indignation, signals an unmet desire or a resource pathway you need to claim. Your disciplined cynicism serves as a necessary protective layer against exploitation and naive optimism in critical negotiations. If you refuse to make the treaty, these forces do not disappear. They simply relocate, manifesting as chronic resentment, passive aggression, or debilitating self-sabotage. The shadow, when denied expression in its true form, always finds an outlet, usually the most destructive and uncontrolled one possible. The application to the present is immediate and critical. In modern professional and social dynamics, the refusal to negotiate this treaty leads directly to exhaustion and burnout. The burden of maintaining a perpetually nice, non-threatening, and morally pristine external facade is a psychological tax few can sustain. The treaty grants you resilience because you are no longer attempting to live up to an impossible ideal. You are moving from the posture of a guilty child who must hide their transgressions to the posture of a sovereign ruler over their entire domain, acknowledging both the fertile fields of light and the deep, rich mines of darkness. This shift liberates vast amounts of psychological bandwidth previously dedicated solely to denial and shame. You gain stability because you cannot be destabilized by your own sudden imperfection. You've already factored it into the cost of operation. The darkness you feared was not a cage you needed to escape. It was the leverage you needed to exert. Accept the treaty. Gain the leverage. The inevitable resonance of quiet confidence. The inertial power of the unexpressed self. Do you ever notice how the loudest people in the room, those who aggressively seize conversational space, often hold the least sustained attention in the long run? True influence is not broadcast. It is not a declaration that requires volume or fanfare. It is perceived subtly, inevitably. It is the deep, consistent hum that exists beneath the frantic noise of performance. We are entering the domain of quiet confidence, a psychological architecture that bypasses the need for validation entirely, making it one of the most potent and defensive positions in any power dynamic. Quiet confidence is not the absence of doubt, but the profound refusal to allow doubt to govern your presence, your reaction, or your decisions. It is the unwavering understanding that your intrinsic value is fixed, non-negotiable, and certainly not contingent upon external praise, achievement markers, or applause. It operates entirely outside the transactional economy of the fragile ego, that anxious mechanism which constantly demands to be paid in admiration and visibility. The moment you place your self-worth into the hands of the audience, you are playing a rigged game, where the audience always holds the power to withdraw the payment, reducing your perceived value to zero. To grasp the physics of this power, imagine a vast, deep ocean trench versus a shallow, noisy stream. The stream rushes, bubbles, and crashes against every stone, advertising its rapid movement, desperate for witnesses to its motion. The trench, however, is silent, slow, and immense. Its gravity dictates the flow of major currents worldwide, moving unimaginable volume without a single surface wave of self-assertion. It does not need to prove its depth. Its very existence changes the entire global system. That is the mechanism of quiet confidence. It is the realization that if you are genuinely powerful, you do not need to signal it. The effect of your presence is enough. The paradox at the heart of most psychological manipulation is this: the performance of confidence, the aggressive posture, the raised volume, the need to dominate conversation, the over-explanation of one's credentials, is always a compensatory mechanism for deep-seated insecurity. It is a defense designed to shield the internal vulnerability, yet it inevitably creates a target. When you aggressively seek validation, You hand the keys to your internal state over to external critics or rivals. You become reactive. Quiet confidence, conversely, offers no such leverage. It provides nothing for the critic to grasp. By refusing to engage in the game of self-justification, you create an absence, a vacuum of self-definition that others instinctively try to fill. They project their own expectations, their own fears, and their own weight onto your composure and your silence. Your refusal to engage in the proof game forces others to question their own assumptions about you, rather than focusing on questioning your competence. In the modern age of incessant signaling, an era defined by the digital scream, this posture is truly revolutionary. Every notification, every perfectly filtered image, every curated identity is designed to shout, "I matter, look at me." But this relentless signaling exhausts the audience. The individual who refuses to participate in this desperate economy of visibility instantly becomes an anomaly, a place of stillness and rest within the chaos. You become defined not by what you post, but by what you withhold, not by what you chase, but by the quiet composure with which you observe the frantic motion of everyone else. The true psychological power of this state is that it renders many standard manipulation tactics completely inert. Gaslighting depends entirely on the victim's dependence on external reality checks, a desperate need for the manipulator to confirm their stability. Intimidation works only on those who fear external judgment more than they trust their internal baseline. When you are quietly settled in your own center, resistant to the need for external confirmation, the attempts to destabilize you look like what they truly are: frantic, wasted energy from the manipulator. You transition from being a responsive object, a target to be controlled, into a stable environment that simply absorbs the energy directed at it. You stop trying to convince the world you are powerful or competent. You simply are the thing they are struggling to define, the silent pillar against which they test their own weakness. The silence you carry is not a void, it is the ultimate, unassailable boundary. The threshold of tolerable uncertainty. We arrive now at Block 30, a concept we title simply, the threshold of tolerable uncertainty. It is the invisible fence line separating enduring anxiety from decisive action. Have you ever noticed that true peace is not the absence of problems, but the certainty, good or bad, of their dimensions? That sometimes the knowing is a greater relief than the outcome itself? This threshold defines the moment where the need for structure overwhelms the fear of consequences. Psychologically, your threshold of tolerable uncertainty is the operational limit of your cognitive holding capacity. It's the highest level of ambiguity you can manage before your system defaults to the quickest path to resolution, even if that path is suboptimal. It is the point where the cost of waiting for clarity exceeds the cost of making a flawed choice. In the context of power dynamics, the manipulator doesn't need to force your hand. They only need to keep you hovering just below that threshold until you volunteer the surrender, simply to alleviate the chronic drain of the weight. It is a state of active, sustained erosion of emotional reserves. Imagine receiving a vague, highly concerning email late Friday afternoon from a source you respect, stating, "We need to discuss the future of Project Chimera, but I can't elaborate until Monday morning." For 60 hours, your cognitive machinery is locked in a loop of scenario planning. You are not worried about the content of the meeting. You are worrying about the shape of the worry. This prolonged, unstructured anticipation burns more psychological energy than the actual bad news ever will. The uncertainty acts as a controlled neurotoxin. Your mind desperately attempts to collapse the possibilities, to define the threat so that it can be neutralized or accepted. If you cannot define it, you cannot process it, and the energy required to maintain multiple concurrent defense strategies exhausts the system. The core mechanism here exploits the brain's preference for metabolic efficiency, holding conflicting possibilities open. A could happen, or B, or C, all requiring different strategic defenses, is intensely costly. When you push a mind close to its threshold, the subconscious system screams for discharge. This is often why people will rush into an unnecessary argument or escalate a minor conflict. to force the other party to reveal their full position, simply so the waiting can end. The paradox is that the subject will often choose the option that promises immediate informational closure, even if it carries the highest long-term risk. They choose the pain they can define over the possibility they cannot quantify. This is why masterful negotiators often introduce multiple layers of confusing, semi-related demands right before the final concession. They increase the fog to lower the threshold instantly, making the core demand seem like a comparatively palatable relief. Look at modern connection, the ghosting phenomenon, the deliberately vague text message response, the calculated delay in commitment. These aren't acts of simple malice. They are strategic operations of uncertainty maintenance. The person who keeps you guessing holds the gravitational center of the dynamic. They manage the flow of information precisely to keep you suspended in anticipation, guaranteeing their continued psychic relevance until you break the tension by initiating contact, offering the concession they desire, or capitulating to their terms just to restore equilibrium. They are not waiting for you to decide. They are waiting for you to collapse under the pressure of the indefinite wait. What happens internally when you live consistently near this threshold? You develop an atrophy of self-sovereignty. You become deeply reactive, constantly scanning the environment for cues that might reduce the cognitive load. You trade internal stability for external reassurance. You seek anchors in others because you cannot tolerate the feeling of groundlessness. The philosophical implication is severe. When you tolerate prolonged, intentional uncertainty, you teach yourself that relief is an external gift, not an internal discipline. You surrender the power of defining reality to the person holding the information faucet. Your strength is revealed not by what you conquer, but by the chaos you can withstand while remaining centered. Recognize when the unknown is accidental and when it is strategically deployed against you. Your threshold is the gate of your peace. Guard it fiercely. The echo chamber of self-deception. The self-sealing system of denial is not merely a defense mechanism. It is the fundamental infrastructure of human fragility. Have you ever felt utterly secure in a foundational belief about yourself, your partner, or your professional path, only to realize years later that the comfort itself was the trap? We are our most efficient and effective liars, capable of crafting internal realities so convincing that the conscious mind becomes a willing accomplice to its own manipulation. Self-deception is the mechanism where the conscious ego constructs a narrative that successfully protects it from a threatening, painful, or inconvenient reality, and then forces the subconscious to accept that narrative as absolute objective truth. It is not just about hiding the truth from the outside world. It is about aggressively burying the searing pain of truth deep within yourself, ensuring that you cannot locate it even if you went looking. This internal blindness is precisely where the true vulnerability to external power resides. If you can lie to yourself successfully, anyone who masters the key to your internal narrative can and will hijack your operating system. Imagine your mind as a heavily armored room, a psychological comfort fortress. You built this complex structure not to keep enemies out, but specifically to prevent the brutal, unfiltered sunlight of reality from touching the delicate, true self inside. It is a structure of comfort, not defense. Every time a disconfirming fact arrives, a devastating critique of your project, a clear flaw in your character, an unmistakable sign of betrayal from someone close, you do not initiate repairs on the wall. Instead, you instantly plaster over the crack with a new, comforting belief, a new layer of wallpaper made of plausible deniability, justified outrage, or manufactured exceptionalism. The fortress feels sturdy and safe because you reinforce the narrative daily, but it is actually a decaying structure held together only by wishful thinking, cognitive dissonance, and the sheer volume of lies you tell yourself about its structural integrity. The paradox of self-deception is brutal. The greater your emotional investment in maintaining a false, comfortable reality, the exponentially easier you become to control. The master manipulator does not fight your self-deception. They embrace it, they nourish it, they feed it gourmet meals. They spend their time meticulously finding the specific narrative you rely on to maintain your comfort, whether it is the belief that I am always the smartest person in the room, my partner would never hurt me, or my efforts, regardless of the outcome, will inevitably lead to success. Once identified, the manipulator simply reinforces that lie. They become the single, reliable, resounding echo in your chamber. When someone affirms the lie you desperately need to believe, you instantly grant them total, unquestioning credibility. You trade objective, critical judgment for emotional validation, and that validation becomes their primary leash. The higher the price of facing the truth, the lower the price of your loyalty to the person willing to tell you the lie. Look at your life right now. Where are you actively avoiding the ledger? Is it the financial debt you refuse to calculate, the toxic dynamic in your family you refuse to name, or the failed ambition you know is dead but keep dragging along like a beloved corpse? Self-deception thrives uniquely well in the modern environment of curated information. We have built digital echo chambers where confirmation bias is not just a statistical phenomenon, but a monetized industry. We create a perpetual feedback loop of agreeable lies. We hire people, follow leaders, and consume media exclusively because they tell us the precise lie we already told ourselves this morning. This isn't merely political or social, it's profoundly personal. We seek environments where our internal fortress is applauded. True psychological power is not derived from successfully imposing your will upon the external world. It comes from the radical, unwavering transparency you maintain with your internal self. The hidden cost of persistent self-deception is not moral failure, but structural failure. When the inevitable external shock arrives, the financial crisis, the public exposure, the catastrophic failure, the person operating on a foundation of comforting lies shatters instantly because their entire worldview was a fantasy. Conversely, the person who faced the difficult, bitter, inconvenient truths internally has already prepared the contingency plan, having run the simulation of failure repeatedly in their mind. You cannot hope to win a high-stakes psychological game that you are actively cheating yourself in. The truth may be bitter medicine, but lies are the ultimate cumulative poison. Stop trying to negotiate terms with objective reality. You are only free to truly act when you first accept the precise dimensions of the uncomfortable, painful prison you are currently inhabiting. The lock on the door to your escape is always on the inside. The seduction of the unfinished conversation. You know that specific, lingering sting, that sentence you wish you had finished, that connection that vanished just before resolution, the thought that circles endlessly in your mind hours after the interaction concluded. It is the purest form of psychological gravity, and it is known as the Zeigarnik shadow, why incomplete thoughts bind us. We are discussing the law of persistence, or why the human brain obsesses over open loops. Why do we spend hours replaying a half-said sentence from a crucial interaction? Why is the almost relationship often more haunting than the one that ended definitively and cleanly? The answer is found in the architectural flaw of our consciousness, a flaw that masters of influence know how to exploit with surgical precision. This phenomenon is a design oversight in the human operating system, one codified by the Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s. Following studies on memory and waiters who could flawlessly recall complex open orders but instantly forget completed ones, the effect was defined. Tasks interrupted and left incomplete are remembered up to 90% better than tasks brought to full completion. When this principle is applied to power dynamics, to persuasion, and to personal relationships, it isn't just about memory, it's about presence. The unsaid word, the unresolved conflict, the implication left hanging. These are the mental anchors that chain your focus to the manipulator long after they have walked away or stopped texting. The Zeigarnik effect in social influence means the power is held not by the person who speaks the last word, but by the person who forces the listener to supply the missing words, the missing resolution, the missing certainty. Consider the master storyteller, the high-stakes negotiator, or the strategically elusive romantic partner. They never give you the full story, the definitive answer, or the final validation. They structure the interaction so that the most compelling, high-stakes piece of information, the vulnerability they hinted at, the promise they whispered, the judgment they subtly implied, is delivered, and then the conversation is abruptly, sometimes rudely, terminated. They cut the cognitive wire. It's not a lapse in politeness. It's calculated cognitive warfare. You, the recipient, spend the next hour, the next day, the next week, burning emotional and intellectual energy trying to close the loop that they deliberately ripped open. Your brain screams for equilibrium, but the external source of that equilibrium, the person who can complete the sentence, is gone. The mechanism is rooted in our fundamental, deep-seated need for cognitive closure. When a task or interaction begins, the brain allocates specific mental resources, psychic energy, dynamic tension, whatever you wish to call it, to its successful resolution. Completion acts like a mental checklist item being ticked off, allowing the brain to archive the event, release the resources, and forget the details. Interruption, however, causes those mobilized resources to remain active, buzzing, generating cortisol, and demanding resolution. This buzzing is the engine of obsession, the relentless internal monologue about the interaction. The manipulator knows that if they give you absolute completion, absolute certainty about their feelings, absolute confirmation of your value, absolute definition of the relationship, you will file them away and move on. Their power relies entirely on the debt of unresolved attention you owe them, the mental real estate you surrender simply because they refuse to provide the final comma. Look at the architecture of modern digital communication and the psychology of influence. Every application is built on this principle. The notification bubble, the social media thread that cuts off mid-sentence, the text message left on read without a corresponding reply, the dating profile that ends the interaction just when the emotional stakes are highest. We are swimming in zygarnic loops, intentionally engineered to prevent cognitive filing. The person who masterfully wields this law does not need to be physically present to dominate your thoughts. They simply need to ensure that every interaction, whether brief or profound, ends with a slightly elevated emotional temperature and an unanswered critical question hanging in the air. This forces you to carry the weight of the conversation for them. The profound psychological cost here is that your attention, your most precious finite resource, is being borrowed, leveraged, and spent by external forces that refuse to provide the necessary closure. Your own mind becomes an echo chamber dedicated to solving their puzzle. True power, in the face of this manipulation, is the ability to recognize when someone else is intentionally structuring your reality with incomplete sentences, and the ability to internally refuse the task. The countermeasure is radical self-completion, deciding that the missing piece of information, the lack of external validation, or the refusal of closure does not constitute a deficit in your reality. You choose to mentally file the interaction as complete with missing external data, and instantaneously reclaim your allocated psychic energy. You do not wait for the final word. You grant yourself the final word. Understand this. The unfinished conversation is not a lapse in communication. It is a calculated emotional trap. The quiet confidence to release the need for their final word is the ultimate act of liberation from psychological bondage. The greatest power move is to close the loop they intended to leave open. The final law, awakening before the alarm. The principle of exhaustive awareness. After 32 laws of consequence, control, and calculated coercion, we arrive at the final threshold. It's not about what others are doing to you. It's about what you are now aware of doing to yourself. This culmination of dark psychology grants a unique, weighty freedom. Do you ever feel the subtle, creeping weight of the knowledge you now possess? Can you truly manipulate others, or are you simply observing the pre-programmed movements of machines? recognizing the gears because you've studied the schematics until dawn. Exhaustive awareness is the point where pattern recognition transcends utility and becomes prediction. The moment you see the trap laid out, not just for others, but potentially for you, even if you are the one holding the bait. This law dictates that when the entire system of influence and control is mapped out in your mind, your true power is unlocked by the choice you make regarding the map itself. Its relevance lies in the profound shift from being a participant in the social game to becoming the architect, and sometimes the disillusioned historian, of that game. We're discussing the psychological maturity that comes when power, fully understood, reveals its own essential emptiness. Imagine a grandmaster not just playing one game of chess, but seeing 20 simultaneous games, all across different boards, yet recognizing that every single one follows the exact same 64 squares and the same limited set of movements. The pleasure isn't in winning, it's in the quiet, devastating knowledge that the opponent's brilliant sacrifice was predictable, move 7, 4 different ways. You are no longer surprised by human nature. You are simply weary of its relentless consistency, its unwavering adherence to the very laws we have spent this time documenting. This knowledge grants you foresight, but it simultaneously steals the thrill of spontaneity and the comfort of innocence. This is where the tension arises, the conflict between the sheer power these laws grant you and the profound isolation they often enforce. You master the silent language of compliance, the subtle pressure points, the intricate mechanisms of fear and desire. But the more fluent you become in this hidden tongue, the fewer genuine conversations you can truly have. Every interaction becomes layered. You are now playing a continuous dual role, the engaged participant and the forensic psychological auditor. You are analyzing cadence, checking for anchoring, scanning for cognitive load, and simultaneously presenting the version of yourself designed to elicit the most predictable, cooperative response. The insight is that true power isn't forcing a decision, it's understanding the exact calculation that led to the illusion of a decision being made freely. The paradox is that the more control you gain externally, the more you risk becoming controlled by the necessity of maintaining that absolute vigilance. Apply this principle to your life now. Look at the curated feeds, the algorithms, the tailored aggression of modern digital discourse. You see the patterns immediately. You recognize the law of social proof being weaponized in every comment section. You see the scarcity principle driving every limited time offer, every carefully staged public feud. Your mind, now finely tuned by these 32 laws, rejects the intended signal and sees only the noise, the transparent structure designed to harvest your attention, your reaction, and ultimately, your compliance. This awareness is exhausting, yes, but it is the prerequisite for reclaiming your cognitive sovereignty. You cannot truly be manipulated by a machine whose operating code you fully comprehend. The philosophical impact of exhaustive awareness is the birth of radical acceptance paired with radical non-participation. You cease chasing outcomes built on manufactured desire because you see the strings of the desire itself. You realize that the greatest power isn't the ability to influence others, but the ability to withdraw entirely from the arenas where these 32 laws thrive. The shift occurs when you recognize that waking up before the alarm isn't about gaining extra time to strategize. It's about recognizing that the alarm clock, the social mandate, the perpetual need for validation, the relentless drive for external power was set by someone else entirely. You are now fully awake, and you possess the agency to dismantle the clock itself. You understand the rules, and thus you are no longer bound by them. This final law is the quiet realization that the deepest form of power is the conscious, deliberate choice to become boring to the sophisticated manipulator, including the inner manipulator demanding constant engagement. Know the laws, but let the most powerful realization be this: the final move is the one you choose not to make. Not many reach the end awake. Leave a single word that defines this journey, and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight.